Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Hi there.
My name is John Yates. I chair the technology practice here at Morris, Manning & Martin, and we are very pleased to be hosting this event today. If you look at your materials on your chair, you'll see our topic is Beyond Blockchain 101 Roundtable. But I think maybe the more appropriate title, if you open it up, is the subtitle: The Hype, the Challenge, the Risk, the Future. I'm particularly pleased today to recognize the two co-sponsors and really the organizers of this event, and appreciate very much their hard work. Roop Singh from Intuit Factory and Austin Mills with Morris, Manning & Martin. Austin chairs our blockchain and cryptocurrency practice. Let's give them a hand, please. We're also excited about having this good-looking crowd here on the screen, our live streaming group, and we'll be talking more about them and getting introductions from the panelists in just a minute. Let me say also, though, it's interesting how blockchain has come of age. The way I know it's come of age is because of the number of people here, and also because the fact that some of the people that are involved in blockchain now are wearing ties. So it's gone traditional, and I think that's a bit scary because it means a lot of traditional businesses don't understand it, but know that it's going to be relevant to their business. Let me tell you a quick show of hands. How many folks here 5 years ago had heard of blockchain? Let the record reflect there's about 6 or 7 liars in the audience here. How many folks a year ago were aware of blockchain? That's just about everybody. Well, we have a very good opportunity here, thanks to the work that Roop and Austin have done and these impressive panelists and our folks live streaming, to be able to turn blockchain into the next level. And in particular, let me say too, as you go through the session today and you think about Beyond Blockchain 101, think about how we can make Atlanta a capital of blockchain. We have that opportunity. We have financial technology. We've got other kinds of technology. We've got traditional businesses. So when you walk away from this session today, come away with some good questions. Send Austin and Roop those questions, but think about how we can make Atlanta a blockchain capital. Again, we're live streaming, so we have the mics that are turned on, so we'll be able to communicate. But when you do, if you do have questions, please make sure that you speak loudly so that our folks on the live stream can hear. And again, thank you for being here. Give yourself another hand. I'll turn it over to Ruth.
Thank you, John. Wow, that's loud. So let's do a quick show of hands. How many of you think Bitcoin is a bubble? About 5% of the room. How many of you own Bitcoin? How many of you think that any other coins, the altcoins, that is a bubble? A bubble, yes. Okay. How many of you think there is going to be a crash?
Which one today?
A crash. A correction, maybe. Wonderful. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Roop Singh, and I run a small but mighty consulting firm in this space called Intuit Factory, and I will be your moderator for this roundtable. I promise to be very biased in my approach. So as John was saying, decentralized technologies, popularly known as blockchain, have captured our imagination. A few years from now, we wouldn't probably say that unless you were one of the front runners in the space. But to look at blockchain as merely a technology is probably myopic. Imagine being born in a time, maybe the 1800s, when the combustion engine was being adopted and the mass railroads were being adopted. It fundamentally transformed trade, commerce, travel, transportation, and even war. It impacted how we as humans interacted with other humans, how we exchanged ideas, how we connected, made a people-to-people connection, what we ate, where we migrated, and fundamentally how we lived our lives. Some call that a state of technology and a state of civilization. Our state of civilization today has certainly changed, brought to you by the blockchain ecosystem. Now, I'm certainly not the first one to say this. I'm not that smart. Regardless of wherever you find yourself on this blockchain journey, you probably had a similar experience. When these concepts finally clicked, it was like you had made a profound discovery. Something shifted in you. You started seeing the world slightly differently. As I speak to people about this, on any given day, we live in either the fear of missing out or the fear of jumping in. Today, we'll explore the hype, the opportunity, the challenges, and the risks in this space. We wanted to go beyond the basics, so we gathered a few world leaders in this space. Let's look at some data. Since January of 2016, over 250 ICOs have raised more than $2 billion. Corporate and their venture arms have invested over $1 billion in blockchain-related ventures since 2013. Projects have moved from initial ventures into wallets, exchanges, and mining to payments and to other verticals like media, healthcare, agri-tech, asset management, social networks, and prediction markets. Today, it's hard to even find a sector that is not being talked about as being quote-unquote disrupted by blockchain. Well, the hype is such. Talking about the hype, when Vladimir Putin, Floyd Mayweather, and Paris Hilton are tweeting about ICOs, you know we are in hype season. Have you heard of the TV series, or Netflix series rather, Mr. Robot? They have weaved cryptocurrency in their storyline. And get this, how many of you watched The Big Bang Theory? They're about to do an entire episode on Bitcoin. So we have already put spinach, tomatoes, and diamonds on the blockchain. Wonder what's next. So as you settle down in this space, let me quickly walk you through the format. We'll start with a round of introduction for the panelists. I'll introduce them briefly, and then we'll ask them something exciting about their companies or their projects they're working on. And then we will get into 3 rounds of detailed, deep discussion. You have your handouts, and they mention the rounds of discussion. There will be a short break after each round. Each round is roughly 40 minutes. And after those 3 rounds, we will get into an open Q&A round for the entire audience. Our scope is wide, and our discussion is nuanced. So with your cooperation and focus, we can navigate this and get the most out of this roundtable. So with that, let me get started with the introductions, please. I'll start in the order in your handout so you can follow. Dr. Vic, who's joining us from London over there. Hey, Vic. He has a PhD in pure and applied mathematics, and he's also the COO of a company called Nawara, which is solving the institutional finance markets in United Kingdom. Mitchell Koppelman, right here. He's the partner in charge of Aperio's tax practice, as well as the technology and biosciences group. Andrew Levine, who's on the screen. Hey, Andrew. He's with Steemit. He is the community liaison for Steemit, and now he's involved in nearly all non-engineering efforts within the company, including content, communications, marketing, and public relations. Austin Mills, my fellow partner in crime. Austin is an attorney at Morris, Manning & Martin, corporate technology practice, and the chair of the blockchain and cryptocurrency group. Jim Nasser, there, hey Jim, is the chief software architect at the CDC. Stephen Pear, hey Stephen, he's the CEO of BitPay, a company you probably used if you transacted anywhere using Bitcoin. Dr. Marta, hi Marta. She's also joining us from London at the moment. She serves as the director of ecosystem at Hyperledger, and she's also a PhD in user-informed design of privacy tools. Jack Saba. Hey, Jack. He's the managing partner of Day One Investments. Day One Investment is a blockchain-specific seed and Series A venture capital firm. Dr. Beozong Yang. Dr. Yang is an associate professor of finance at Georgia State University. He also holds a PhD in mathematics from MIT and has taught at Stanford University, and he currently leads the development of FinTech Lab at the Robinson College of Business at Georgia State. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Let's start with...
Hey, come on, let's give it a big round of applause.
Thank you for that. Let's start with sharing something about your companies or some recent exciting developments in your project. And how about we start with you over there, Jim?
Sure. Yes, hello, everyone. Okay, yeah, there we go. Yes, I'm Jim Nasser. Whoa, a little bit less loud. I'm the chief software architect over at CSAILS, which is a division of our center at the CDC. My focus really is building what amounts to scientific and external-facing applications at the CDC. So over the last couple of years, we've kind of taken on this I guess, modernization effort, if you like, of conceiving software really as what you would consider as world approach these days, microservices and containers and modern DevOps. And we've kind of built that out. And as we've done this, we've realized that there's a real opportunity for certain use cases, not every use case, but there are a number of use cases, including, for instance, tracking opioids in real time or emergency response, to use blockchain as a core component, but not the only component, right? That's key. That's a very important thing, because I certainly don't believe blockchain is a magical thing that, grows wings. And
Is it not?
Not yet. Steve may tell me otherwise, but, So, anywho, we see it as a component, and the reason is this. Though it may not seem obvious, in the public health space, CDC is really just a peer amongst a group of peers, such as state health departments, like state of Georgia or Minnesota or what have you, right? And the idea is even though the mission is the same, it doesn't necessarily mean that you implicitly trust each other. It doesn't necessarily mean that data flows efficiently. In fact, it's anything but efficient. So that's really the underpinning is there's a trust, kind of component that we like to improve, as well as getting to data transparency and being able to, share a lot more efficiently. And all of that really is reasons behind what we've done. And we're doing quite a bit around blockchain.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks.
Mitchell?
Hi, this is Mitchell Kopelman. I'm with the accounting consulting firm Aprio. We have been working with companies dealing with accounting and tax issues on the blockchain for about 4 years now. Last year, we are working with both domestic and international token sale transactions. So we have quite a few clients that we are addressing with them their previously conducted ICOs, and we're consulting with about a dozen folks right now on their pending ICOs. And essentially, we've developed an expertise both in the accounting, audit, and tax area to address both cryptocurrency and token transactions.
Thank you, Mitchell. Stephen?
I'm Stephen Pear, co-founder and CEO of BitPay. We're the world's largest payment processor for cryptocurrency. We do about $1.5 billion annually in transactions. We started the company back in 2011. We were excited back then to do 5 or 10 transactions a day. Today we do on the order of about 10,000 a day. Exciting things that we're doing. In a few weeks, we'll launch our second blockchain for payments. So we're excited about that. Doing a lot of work to prepare ourselves to add support for multiple blockchains in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stephen. Austin?
I'm Austin Mills. In the technology practice at Morris Manning. So, sort of fell into Bitcoin a little bit early on, being at the intersection of technology and fintech and payments. And much like Mitchell, I guess the more exciting things I'm doing are actually what my clients are doing, what I'm supporting, and most of that's pretty confidential. So I don't want to bore you with my day-to-day, but we are actively supporting. It's hard to keep track, but probably about a dozen to 2 dozen clients active in the space. A lot of token sale activity. Obviously, that's become the emerging use case. I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but also other projects. Decentralized exchanges and other initiatives, more B2B and enterprise-related blockchain initiatives and smart contract type issues and things of that nature.
Thank you, Austin. Jack?
Hi, I'm Jack Saba, so managing partner of Day One Investments. We're sector agnostic, blockchain specific, and we see 3 limitations right now that are holding everything back. Regulations are going to stifle innovation. There's a really strong infrastructure, so it's going to make it hard for industry-wide implementations of the technology, and it can't yet scale. So what we're trying to do right now is bring the technology into emerging markets, as well as help one emerging market capture the opportunity with ICOs, since it's getting boxed out of South Korea and China and some other jurisdictions. We're trying to create a framework that supports innovation and consumer protection down there. So it's a little bit about what we're working on.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. Dr. Yang?
Hi, I'm Baozhong Yang. I'm Associate Professor of Finance at Robinson College of Business at GSU. Robinson College is pushing toward the frontier in business, including big data, data analytics, and most recently, we have established a fintech lab. Is the first fintech lab in Georgia. So I'm doing some exciting things there. I think one of the exciting things is that we are trying to build a private blockchain network and study all kind of applications, explore it. And I'm also going to teach a fintech course for our master students next spring. And I think in the future, we think that fintech is going to influence the financial services industry a lot. And we need to educate talent in this area. So we are going to develop more courses and maybe even a concentration in this area.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Yang. Andrew?
Hey, I'm Andrew Levine. I'm the resident non-engineer at Steemit. So we launched one of the first delegated proof-of-stake blockchains. That's Steem. That powers a number of apps. The most significant which is Steemit.com, the social network that we launched that runs on top of the Steem blockchain. 400,000 accounts, the fastest blockchain in the world, is butting up against the 1 million transactions per day limit. Sorry, it's not a limit, it's just the record. Actually, we've already established the record. We're just hoping to break the 1 million transaction mark just for vanity. The most exciting project we're working on now is smart media tokens, which is a protocol similar to ERC20s, but for the Steem blockchain. And what's so special about smart media tokens is that they'll enable any individual, enterprise, organization to launch their very own Steem-like token that will be both fast, 3-second transfers, and with feeless transfers, but most importantly, will have turnkey distribution mechanisms built into these tokens that'll be super easy to just activate. And most people don't realize that 99% of cryptocurrency engineering bandwidth is consumed after the launch of the coin. So smart media tokens are the most exciting thing we're working on.
Thank you, Andrew. And the reason, by the way, I'm looking over there, that's the camera that projects us to them. Dr. Marta?
Thank you. Well, for me, most exciting, I guess, is the fact that I work in open source. So I actually can talk about everything that we're doing, and I'm encouraged to talk about it. So what we do in Linux Foundation, because actually I work for Linux Foundation, and Hyperledger is one of the 15 projects within Linux Foundation. Linux Foundation focuses on open source technologies in enterprise. And Hyperledger was formed about 18 months ago to promote blockchain technologies in open source and create enterprise-grade frameworks in blockchain. So today we are 18 months in. We grew from 30 founding members to 180. We have a massive open source online course that anyone can take. We are not pay to play, so anyone can join, anyone can play with our framework, anyone can use them. And we have massive adoption, which is amazing. We are at 180 members right now. So this is pretty amazing for us. And we have use cases from all over the world.
Thank you, Dr. Marta. Dr. Wick?
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Roop. Thanks for having me on today. Greetings from very cold London. My nose is really cold at the moment. I co-founded a company nearly 2 years ago called Livora. We are operating in the capital market. Our aim is to automate the issuance and administration of financial assets. So what this means is we are automating how legal documents are constructed for securities. We're automating how those documents are coordinated, how their terms are coordinated, how the book building is done, the actual sign-off on the document. We're also automating the clearing and settlement aspects as well. So in the UK, we're regulated by the regulator, the FCA. We have MiFID and CAS approvals here. What that means is we can hold and manage client assets and client money. So we automate the construction of the legal document, but then we also automate the issuance of the security, and we automate how the security is managed throughout its life until it matures. In the UK, we've been in something called the FCA Sandbox. This is a regulatory scheme which the FCA started to encourage innovation in the UK in financial services. We're the only company in the first and the second FCA sandboxes, and the reason is, apart from being a regulated company, we're also experimenting with replacing traditional banking infrastructure with blockchain infrastructure. So in fact, we're the first company in the world to issue regulated securities recorded on public Bitcoin and public Ethereum blockchain. And in a week and a half's time, we will be doing the world's first regulated cryptocurrency issuance in the UK.
Wonderful.
With the blessing of
Thank you, Dr. Wick. That sounds exciting. All right, so with that, let's get into our first topic of discussion, the evolution of technology architecture. And I'll start with Stephen. Considering that SegWit 2 is canceled, 2x is canceled, how do you see the debate between scale, decentralization, and security? Essentially, if Lightning Network is going to be the default scaling mechanism, does it make Bitcoin more centralized or decentralized?
Well, the first question is there a scaling problem? And I would argue that there isn't.
Okay.
If you take a step back and look at the broader ecosystem of cryptocurrencies, ask yourself how many blockchains are there? I mean, there are literally thousands of blockchains. So we can, in fact, put every cup of coffee purchase on a blockchain. We just might not be able to do it all on the same blockchain. So I would argue that there is no scalability problem. There is certainly work to be done on scaling efficiently. So any given blockchain, you can make improvements to make it scale better. So I think the future is, at least in the payments area, payments on multiple blockchains, and those blockchains competing with one another to scale more efficiently. There will also be attributes of those blockchains related to things like decentralization that may be taken into account by the market. So it could be that one blockchain takes it too far and you see centralization. You can imagine a blockchain could degenerate to a single miner, a single large mining farm, and they basically control the entire blockchain. That would diminish the value of the token on that blockchain. I think the market will take those kind of things into account when they weigh the relative value of one blockchain against another. So competition is going to force some incredible innovation over the next couple of years, I think.
Right. So
you asked about SegWit 2x and all. I think as of the beginning of last week, most of the companies were still fully committed to 2x. You kind of had to be committed to it, or else you would diminish its chance of success, until it became clear that there was just not a consensus to be, it was like an 80-20 split between the miners supporting 2x and 20% against. So it just wasn't worth going forward with it. And I think all the companies that were supporting it sort of called on the miners to, back out, because we were going to have to shut down our operations. Most of the exchanges would shut down their operations, and that's just not good. And then you asked about Lightning Network. I don't know. We'll wait and see. When it's available, when somebody has something working, we'll evaluate it. And it might be a way to get scale on a given blockchain or increase the efficient scaling on a given blockchain.
Great. So just continuing on the SegWit 2x topic, how do you see the battle between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash?
What battle? Yeah, I mean, people are pitting that. There are a lot of people that want people to fight with each other. Right. There are a lot of people making bets on one side or the other. I think that's a dumb idea. I hold both Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. I would like them both to succeed. I would like them both to compete and get better, make each other better. I would like to see more forks of Bitcoin. I would like all of those forks to succeed. And I think we've already seen a handful of forks come about. I think you're going to see over the course of the next couple of years hundreds of forks of Bitcoin. I think technically speaking, a fork of Bitcoin is actually superior to something called sidechains. It's technically simpler and addresses all the points that sidechains are trying to address.
Interesting.
I think also some people have made bets on Bitcoin or Bitcoin Cash. Those people are going to, at some point, if one or the other side is losing ground to the other, the people that have an economic interest in one of those forks is going to put pressure on that community to innovate.
Right.
And that will force innovation.
Interesting. So you mentioned forks, just on that topic. Do you think having multiple forks, or we would probably live in a world of probably hundreds of forks, as you said, is that a barrier to mainstream adoption, or is it an enabler?
No, it's an enabler. We now have, on the Bitcoin blockchain, you now have two forks. One that says we need some immediate capacity relief, and the other that says we need to constrain the block size because we're concerned about centralization pressure. I think both are valid viewpoints. I'm not sure what the right balance is, but the competition between the two might find the right balance. And also, if more usage shifts over to Bitcoin Cash and away from Bitcoin, it will solve the fee problem that Bitcoin has, right? If you look at the two of them together, we have a combined 9 megabytes of block size space.
Interesting way to look. So anybody else wants to come in on the SegWit 2x decentralization versus centralization question? Does that excite somebody else? As people are kind of shy about their opinions right now.
I can contribute a little bit.
Please.
Something. Cool. First of all, mainly agree with everything these guys are saying. In a certain sense, not only are the Bitcoin hard forks versions of Bitcoin, but we all are. We're all leveraging algorithms that were pioneered in Bitcoin. And I do believe that technology progresses through lots of people experimenting with lots of things, and anybody who thinks they know what's going to win and what isn't is deluding themselves. And the truth is we just need to maximize optionality. And the one contribution I think I can add here is just that people should start looking at alternative metrics about centralization. So like one of the things that we talk about is decentralization in theory versus in practice. So like things like Ethereum and Bitcoin are extremely decentralized in theory and extremely centralized in practice. Whereas if you look at delegated proof of stake chains, you have effectively 20 canonical block producers. And that is more centralized in theory, but it winds up being more decentralized in practice because all these people can do is produce blocks, and they can be elected and unelected at will. There's tons of competition among the block producers. And so through these alternative mechanisms for producing blocks outside of proof of work, you can actually achieve orders of magnitude improvements in efficiency while maintaining as much decentralization in practice.
Interesting. What I find quite... yeah, go ahead, Vic.
Well, sorry, Roop. So yeah, just probably 2 points. I'll echo Stephen's comments. I think that scaling is not too much of an issue right now. It's good to have competing chains and forks. That's all great. I think on the point of SegWit 2, personally, I was against SegWit 2. I think it kind of fragments the community as much as anything else. However, I found myself in a room with most of the SegWit 2 proponents about 2 weeks ago. And in their favor, they were very against fracturing the community also. They felt like, doing a fork would benefit in some way the entire ecosystem, but they wanted everybody to be cohesive. So I just wanted to put that out there. They never intended at all to fragment the community, and that's why they actually called off SegWit 2.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. That's very nice to know. I think we all want that. What I find interesting in the media discourse, we have gone around the circle from Bitcoin is bad to blockchain is good. And you know, I think Andrew, you said we're all children of Bitcoin in a way. You know, that's where it all started. So I appreciate that sentiment. Andrew, you started talking about some consensus mechanisms, so I want to take the discussion there. Within proof of stake, proof of work, and a number of other of these experimental consensus mechanisms thrown around, which one do you think will succeed, and more specifically in the public blockchain environment?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, you know, I'm always very wary of, sorry, wary is not the right word, but like anytime there's a ton of developers looking to solve a problem with a specific protocol, you gotta give them some credit and think that, you know, they have every chance of succeeding. So like, as far as Ethereum's scaling strategy, and everything's gotta go proof of stake by my analysis, unless you wanna create commodity coins. So like, Bitcoin, in my opinion, I'm no expert, and the longer I stay at Steemit, the less of an expert I become on Bitcoin. But you know, this is digital gold to me. Its strength is always going to be as this thing that's kind of just hard to produce. If you want to, for protocol coins, I think proof of stake is the only way to scale it. Ethereum's strategy for scaling it seems to me borderlining on a perpetual motion machine. They're basically projecting out, you know, 1,000x improvement in scale like that. And people who study technology understand that that's not really how it works. As far as we go, our scalability projections are much more reasonable, and we started at a much higher output. So it's much more believable in that context, whereas Ethereum's plan is still highly decentralized, which means highly redundant and highly difficult to scale. So I'm sorry, I've kind of lost track of my thought here.
That's fine. So I want to bring in Stephen. Seems like you might have a thought to share there.
Well, I just thought I thought the comment about Ethereum was funny. Yeah, proof of stake. You know, we haven't ourselves delved too far into the proof of stake blockchains. There's another coin out there called Dash that does something interesting. It has a concept of master nodes, and it allows you to do what they call an instant payment. And you know, I think that's very interesting because it's very similar to a direction that we're headed on the Bitcoin blockchain with our architecture, which is to move completely to an SPV architecture, which means we won't be validating every transaction. We will rely solely on the miners to do that validation, but we do need information about zero confirmation transactions from mining pools. And so what I see in Dash is a more of a formalization of that very same mechanism that we're thinking about doing on the Bitcoin blockchain, but formalizing it in the protocol. And when I hear about, you know, delegated proof of stake, I think there's some very similar, a lot of similarities in how that works as well. So the master nodes in Dash are kind of a proof of stake like thing.
Yeah. Austin?
Stephen, do you see Bitcoin moving towards adopting a privacy mechanism like Dash has, or do you see it staying as a completely just pseudo-anonymous?
I think we'll definitely see some forks of Bitcoin that are more, you know, have more privacy on the blockchain. I think Zcash is interesting. There are a lot of coins out there doing some interesting work in that area. Zcash is employing new, more recent advancements in cryptography to try and get more privacy in terms of what's on the blockchain.
True. Anybody else has any thoughts on that? Yeah?
Yeah, I think an important question to ask, and somebody alluded to this before, is, you know, where is the pressure going to come from, like, as far as the teams developing these protocols? So, like, for us, we have ordinary people using a social network every day. and every vote, every comment, every article is a transaction. And we need to make sure that we always have plenty of runway, because we don't get one day where nothing works. So we have a lot of pressure on us to make sure that we're scaling. Whereas when you look at these other protocols, well, they're not even protocols. I wouldn't even call Dash a protocol. So they may be able to scale, but what are their primary directives? They're building better Bitcoin, let's be honest. They're using a delegated proof of stake model to create better Bitcoin, which, you know, there's a lot of Bitcoin chains that are doing a great job of that. So, you know, I'm kind of skeptical about their ability to scale, and then if they scale, what you'll be able to actually do with that chain, because it's not a protocol. Delegated proof of stake, I just want to point out, a lot of people aren't familiar with it, but both BitShares and Steem have been running for over 2 years. It's incredibly resilient. It's as game theoretically secure. And what I think people need to emphasize their attention on is the number one resource that is created by blockchains is trust. And the trick is going to be what is the right amount of centralization you build into your system while maintaining 100% game theoretical trust. That's the real question to me.
Okay. So related to that, you know, this kind of came up in one of the discussions here. While Bitcoin is appreciating in value and the network fees are rising, the volatility is high, do we see Bitcoin more as digital gold, or do we actually think of this as succeeding as a currency for transactions in the long term? Would it become the default store of value, or just a widely used medium of exchange? Future projections.
So I want to. So this is an interesting question. Actually, a lot of people ask the question: where does the value of Bitcoin come from? I think different people may have different views, but I think for a coin like Bitcoin, because it's not backed by government, it's not backed by any commodity value. So there has to be some kind of value there. Otherwise, in the long run, people may not assign a very high value to it. So I think the value of usage is important. So that's actually related to the scalability problem. I think in the short run, maybe if it's not scalable, it's not a big problem because so many people are already using Bitcoin. But in the long run, perhaps the really scalable coin, scalable currency will win out in the long run because they will really provide convenience, hopefully provide security and all the benefits of Bitcoin. So I think the value is important.
When people ask me about the digital gold question, my response is, if you want gold, buy gold.
Wonderful. So, Dr. Yang, you don't believe that value comes from the fact that it is scarce. You believe the value comes from the potential use cases and how many places we could adopt it and use it.
Right. I think even currently, actually, Bitcoin is valuable because people are actually using it, especially for international transactions, right? Because it's very costly and very time-consuming to transfer money internationally.
Right.
But Bitcoin is really valuable for that. So.
Yeah, go ahead.
So there's a likelihood that there'll be multiple countries in the future that their only currency is a digital currency. And so I think that when people talk about the fact that there's nothing backed, there's nothing backing Bitcoin or most of the virtual currencies today, I don't really think that matters that much.
Okay.
Because you're dealing with the economic variable of supply and demand. And if people have something that other people want, at the end of the day, that's what we're relying on. There's going to be some countries have already announced that they're going to have their own blockchain and their own currency just sitting on a blockchain. That will probably happen. But at the end of the day, I don't think people buy, the US dollar is a little different. Okay? But if you take out the top 20% of the countries in the world and you look at the bottom 80%, people would be much happier with a cryptocurrency than a currency behind a corrupt government.
Right.
And we have lots of corrupt governments all over the world and emerging areas, some countries that have been in existence for hundreds of years. So I think the value, when you talk about a bubble, I mean, you essentially have a value in lots of cryptocurrencies that as long as there's a demand and there's supply and you've got that balance, to me, that's what's going to continue to drive the usage. And as the usage becomes more relevant and more prevalent, you'll have perhaps maybe something more stable versus the ups and downs that we've seen. But I don't think it matters whether a country is behind any cryptocurrency.
Yeah, interesting. So we have seen a lot of interesting uptake and adoption from countries where there's a lot of political or economic strife, just generally on cryptocurrencies and specifically on Bitcoin. Jim, you had a point?
It was really just the last question. So the way I see it, I think there is, as independent people trying to understand this, I think we have to separate signal versus noise. So the way I see kind of what's happening with Bitcoin, in fact, also it's like with 2x and the noise around it, is that the signal is that it's a positive network effect. And the network effect is all about blockchain. It's about rethinking what can be done with blockchain. I understand, of course, I certainly don't understand cryptocurrency anywhere near as well as gentlemen here, or Steve in particular. But to me, what I see is that blockchain and what we can do with it to really drive both understanding of how it could help as well as actually implementing it is improving.
Yeah.
Even if there's $300 million that's locked, quote unquote, lost in some wallet or whatever, that's the way I see it. So I think to me it's a positive thing. And I think, it's easy to get hung up on where Bitcoin is today versus yesterday or whatever. But if you look at the trajectory of where we are, I think it's all positive.
Yeah, fair point. Jack?
Right now in the United States, it's being used predominantly as a store of value, right? Like everyone buys in, they hold till it goes high, and then they sell, and then they buy back into the dip, and they're doing these different things. They're not going to the corner store or Starbucks or something and using it as a form of payment yet, because it's not better than our credit cards or our dollar. But if you go to some of these emerging markets, it's significantly better. We're not seeing the adoption yet, but it's starting to come. In Venezuela right now, you no longer go and use cash or count out bills to buy a carton of milk. You weigh boxes of dollars. Like, that's how devalued it is. You need to weigh it in order to understand. Bitcoin is a significantly better form of capital there. It's also a better form of earning revenue. Right now, they're earning something like $20 a month. But with Bitcoin or Ethereum, if they're mining, they start to get 600. And that's going to start bringing it into the country, start thinking it gets circled around because it's a better solution. I think we're a ways away for being a significant transfer of value on day-to-day small transactions that you do at the store, because it needs to be significantly better than cash or card, and that's hard to do here in the States. But we will see it in emerging markets, as he was mentioning.
Yeah, I think we saw. Go ahead, please.
Is it that Bitcoin is significantly better, or is it that the underlying technology is significantly better and it provides better means of transferring values, and Bitcoin is just a proof of concept that it allows that, and we are waiting for implementing something that will replace Bitcoin?
I think it's the underlying technology. I think that's a great point. I think it's the underlying technology, and right now Bitcoin is probably the strongest use case for it. I think that we will see central bank issue digital currencies in the future. I think that's going to be their way of trying to hold on and maintain monetary policy, but with more transparency and more efficiency of trying to move cash around. I think it's a really good point. But right now, Bitcoin's so far beyond everybody else when it comes to payments. And, Litecoin's pretty good and they're really quick and all these different things, but Bitcoin, I think, is where we're going to see the broad initial implementations and proof of concepts in these markets, and then eventually another form of it will come along. So it's a great point. I think it's the underlying technology that creates the solution, and Bitcoin happens to be the one we're using now.
Dr. Vic? Fair point.
Oh, please, it's just Vic. I think Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency has the potential to be widely used in the future. I think a lot of the problems that people associate with Bitcoin could potentially be solved through network upgrades, protocol upgrades. So I don't think that, I think probably like half of the issues that people bring up about Bitcoin probably in my mind don't exist. On the point of a national cryptocurrency, I know that there are quite a few central banks in Europe who are very seriously looking at this. they are considering how they can actually apply monetary and fiscal policy if they launch a cryptocurrency. Launching a cryptocurrency for them means actually pegging fiat currency to a cryptocurrency and then removing the fiat currency from the system. And I think that this could actually be a more efficient form of money in the future. Bitcoin could still exist in that world. You never know.
So what do you see as the trajectory of that adoption of central banks launching national cryptocurrencies and we all living in a world where paper money is not even relevant anymore?
Absolutely fine.
Yeah, I think when you talk about central banks issuing cryptocurrency, I think you're playing with fire. The problem that they're going to have is if they do it right, then you're going to be able to store in your BitPay wallet US dollars issued by the Federal Reserve. And I can do that, and I can make that user experience as safe and actually a lot better, more safe, easier to use than a bank website. So tell me, why would anybody store US dollars in any bank when they can have a better, safer, simpler to use option that doesn't have the counterparty risk of a bank going under? And that's a big problem because suddenly you will have a run on the banking system if you do that. So I think they've got a lot of challenges in how they may incorporate the banks in some way into that process. I'm not sure how they're going to solve it, but it's a big challenge.
It is, and an opportunity.
Kind of tend to agree that I think fiat being issued as a crypto is really just going to highlight how much better some of this is than the fiat that we deal with, right? Because it's not going to be private. It's going to be inflationary. It's going to be all those things. So it's almost, it's the governments of the world legitimizing it and then highlighting how maybe we're better off organizing ourselves around a currency that we decide has value and it has all these benefits over the government run. I mean, I think that's a longer trajectory and not a lot of people think that way, but it's kind of like with all these issues, you almost have to think about, well, how do we get to what was currency in the first place? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why does the government have the authority to do that? Yes, they're a big recipient for tax and all that, but it's not backed by anything anymore. And so ultimately, it's because we as a collective society have given them the authority to do that, and now we can do that in more decentralized ways of organizing ourselves.
Yeah, agreed. Vic?
I think there is a case for banks operating cryptocurrency wallets as well. If we're talking about a central bank issuing a cryptocurrency and ordinary people buying that, there is still some security issues around people holding their own wallets. So I have heard discussions about this, and I think it's something worth considering. Just wanted to throw that out there.
Vic, if central banks are issuing currencies and people are using wallets, are banks necessary, or can people bank directly with central banks?
I think there is a case for both, but I think that in some way a bank could be necessary, particularly in terms of holding or being able to manage people's private keys within a regulatory framework as well.
Right. So I heard banking will remain, but banks may not. So let's do a quick poll here. I just want to get a sense here, and I'm going to put a number in the ground and put a stake in the ground and ask you guys what do you think. So my number is 20 years and 50% of world's transactions will be in cryptocurrencies and not any other form. So question is, do you think it's more than 20 years or is it less than 20 years? Less. Vic says yes. Vic, do you think it's more or less than 20 years?
Less than 20 years.
Okay. Anybody else? Mitchell, do you have a thought?
I don't know. It's too dangerous to take the other side in this room, I think.
I know. That's why I asked.
The banks are slow. So the question is, how fast can the cryptocurrency, how fast can the community take over?
Right. Right. So you believe that banks are slow and their maturation trajectory is going to be slower. And in fact, we'll get into that in the second round when we'll talk about incumbent enterprises.
I think it's going to be more than 20 years. The financial institutions will not let this happen though so quickly. The demise of financial institutions, you're fighting against the financial institutions, and that's going to be the toughest part.
Okay.
So what did you say, 50% in 20 years?
Yes.
I'll take that in 5.
Yeah.
Sweet. Wow.
So the thing about it is that these banks that they're not innovating, leaders of industry that do not innovate will no longer lead. They've got to push the boundaries in order to stay relevant. I think in 50 years, it's going to be closer to 80% that are online and digital. I think that I agree with you. Probably 5 years, 50% of all transactions are going to be done this way.
I think the demand. Just think about online banking.
Yeah. So one at a time, I think we're coming to the closer end of this round. We can take 2 questions. Paul?
No, I just wanted to differentiation between cryptocurrency and a digital currency. Are we talking about adoption of digital currency in 20 years or a blockchain-backed cryptocurrency?
I mentioned cryptocurrency specifically.
Digital currency.
Who do you guys think the biggest loser in all this is?
That's second round, man.
Follow-up question, is it the U.S. government?
Yeah. Good question.
The question is, who do you think is the loser in all of this? And follow-up question, do you think it is the U.S. government?
I think the loser in all of this is going to be the governments that try to stifle innovation. The ones that are really trying to hold back and make sure that they understand it and regulate it are going to provide a competitive advantage to other nations to bring in talent, to bring in resources, and to bring in capital. So I think that they're going to be the biggest losers in all of this. I think that you really need to promote innovation like England's doing with their sandbox, like Japan's doing with their sandbox. And I think you really need to push the boundaries. If you're trying to hold it back, it's going to be as detrimental as trying to hold back the internet.
Interesting. So we've seen a lot of development of special economic zones in the past around some industries, and I think we're seeing some similar developments here within the crypto ecosystem, starting with the regulation and also bringing in a lot more infrastructure and resources. So we talked about that. Do you want to mention a couple of other places that you're working with?
Yeah, so this opportunity that's being presented with the initial coin offerings is an incredible opportunity for everyday individuals to participate in these investments, right? But I think that we need to come into regulations in a responsible way. You have 2 ways of doing it right now. You have Switzerland, which has regulations that already exist that allow this to happen, broadly speaking. And then you have somewhere like China, where they said, shut it down, we don't want it, we don't need it. And so one of the things that we're doing right now is working with the government of Papua New Guinea in order to create a regulatory framework that supports innovation while protecting consumers. Because there's not enough innovation to be spread around, right? Like there's not enough right now. There's not enough quality companies doing really great ICOs and really great startups. So we're trying to create a framework that brings them in, supports what they're doing, and promotes it in the best way possible.
Well, somebody might take a objection to the fact that there's not enough quality innovation in this ecosystem. So we'll cover that in the third round, including the regulatory aspects of ICOs and the geopolitical aspects of it. So here's a technical question back to the original topic. We talked about transactions per second. The question is it because this is a different technology architecture, I'm talking specifically about Bitcoin now, given that it's a different technology architecture than, say, a centralized authority like Visa, should we even compare the transactions per second, or does it even matter at the user experience level? If we come to a ballpark range that the user experience is fine, does it even matter to compare it to a VisaNet or something similar?
Yes, I mean, it does matter. Transactions per second does matter. Visa does, I think, on the order of about, 3,000 transactions per second. And we're not anywhere close to that on one blockchain. Across 1,000, I don't know where we stand. But also, it's important not to compare apples and oranges here. A lot of people say that Bitcoin is incredibly inefficient compared to a centralized, system like a Visa or MasterCard. Not really, because you're doing fundamentally different things. It is like comparing apples and oranges. What you're doing with a Bitcoin blockchain or any blockchain is you're doing real-time reconciliation of thousands of nodes about the definitive or canonical and temporally coherent history in that database. And that's very different than the job that the task that Visa and MasterCard is doing. I mentioned the degenerate case where you have like one miner. Well, if you do degenerate into one miner, you may as well do away with mining and just cryptographically sign those blocks with a private key or keys that you hold. In which case you really are doing what Visa and MasterCard are doing. You're just probably doing it a lot better. So even in that degenerate case, you're doing the same thing that they do. You're just using more advanced technology to do it, right?
Also, I would mention that we are talking here about the importance of transactions per second, but we're forgetting about the whole world of blockchain that is not used for transacting money.
Yeah, so certainly there are other use cases. We'll cover that for sure. I think the screen might be frozen. Mitchell.
No, I'm just waiting.
Okay. Oh, so it's me. Mitchell, you had a point?
Actually, I have a question for my neighbor, Steven. So Steven, right now I can connect a debit card that's running over Visa to my wallet. What do you believe the future is of those transactions interplaying off of each other? And as a consumer, do I really care how fast or how slow anything's happening in the background? Mm-hmm. And do you believe that the Visa network in this case is as important as the blockchain for them to work together?
I mean, it's not hard to imagine them working together. So in some ways, our Visa debit card that we issue is a way to scale, the Bitcoin blockchain. I can do one transaction a week to top up value to that debit card and then spend on the Visa network all day long. And then the issues between a Bitcoin style transaction and a Visa style transaction then come down to it's not just a matter of performance, it's also a matter of security. So it'd be very interesting to see you take that degenerate case of a blockchain and try to use that to do what Visa does today. And that's kind of the vision that we have of the future. But it doesn't matter. You do care about how fast that happens. I was just demoing that this weekend on Saturday, topping up to my debit card. I demoed it to somebody, and the transaction didn't clear on the Bitcoin blockchain until late last night.
Oh my God.
That's not a very good user experience.
Well, that's why you have permissioned blockchains, right? Because people have a
That's true.
disaster.
I think when we've been talking about adoption, we've been talking a lot about consumer adoption. But I mean, there's the other side, at least in the currency use case here, of the merchant experience. And so, yeah, I mean, credit card transactions are easy, but they're being subsidized, in the tune of anywhere from 1% to 5%, depending on how much leverage you have as a merchant. And so, and overstock was a big driver of early merchant adoption. And from a merchant perspective, there's a lot of benefits. The irreversibility of transactions.
So I got one statistic for you since you mentioned the transactions being stuck. Since SegWit2x got canceled, reportedly about $700 million worth were stuck in 115,000 unconfirmed Bitcoin transactions. We can take some questions. You had your hand?
I mean, we were supposed to talk about blockchain in general. And, the reality with Bitcoin, when it was launched, much of the talk was Bitcoin is great, but the reality is blockchain is the future. And so, if going back to your point, the use of blockchain in commercial transactions, not around payments, and where we see that going, that would be nice to hear a little bit about. That was the
right.
That was the future promise of Bitcoin.
Right. And so I believe that both Bitcoin and blockchain have linked trajectories, but yet distinct destinies. So we'll get to that specific use cases, especially in the second round when we talk about enterprise adoption and other use cases apart from currency itself. Right? Any other question? Going once? Going twice? Okay, wonderful. This round is over. So let's take a quick break. Vic, you had a question? Okay, let's take a quick break, a short bio break, not a real social one. And if you would cooperate, we can come back to this room at, let me see the time, 4:25, and we can get started with the second round. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back. We've talked a lot about Bitcoin specifically and about blockchain technology architecture. Now, as soon as you start talking about Bitcoin, people say, oh, that's just one use case. It's currency. And it's probably, arguably, the simplest use case. So let's start exploring other use cases. And when I say that, we open up the Pandora's box here in terms of what could be done on a blockchain. Supply chain use cases come to mind. So here's the question I'll get started with, and this is for you, Dr. Marta. Will private permissionless blockchain or public permission-based blockchain truly redefine supply chains? So follow-up to that is, between the public permissionless blockchains and private permission-based blockchains, which one do you think is more suitable for an enterprise B2B supply chain use case?
Well, let's maybe start for the broader audience with the definition, because there is such a spectrum here, and we hear permissioned, permissionless, private, public, and quite often, even earlier today, I was talking to a student of mine, and she was asking, okay, what is this whole thing? Because I hear all the time all of this. It is very messy. So I will explain it the way that I understand it, and I am very happy for people to challenge me and say, this is bonkers. So I define permissioned and permissionless on the basis of who can write to a blockchain, and public versus private on the basis who can read from a blockchain. And I think that this is a spectrum, right? So permissionless public blockchain is your Bitcoin blockchain. Anyone can read from a blockchain, and anyone can write to this blockchain. So participation is free. Then you have your permissioned private blockchain, one where it is a very limited number of participants who can read from a blockchain and who can write to the blockchain. And it is a very valuable approach. If you think of a blockchain that is within a certain, that has a very particular use case, where they can use, for instance, an engine. And this engine has to be tracked within this company, and it is their own IP. And in this case, if it's a supply chain of this engine and it's their own IP, you really don't want to reveal the secret of, say, Toyota to a Mercedes, right? Mm-hmm. And you really have to protect that. And in scope of that supply chain, it is revolutionary, because it is transparent within that company, and blockchain provides immutability, and it provides transparency. Also, if something goes wrong within a certain set of parts, you can track it down. It provides trust and lack of trusted third parties, but that trusted third party is within a certain group of participants, right? It doesn't have to be global. So that's your permissioned private blockchain, but within a certain group. And then you have the middle part, which is permissioned public blockchains, which means only certain group of people can write to a blockchain, but anyone can read from that blockchain, which means, for instance, university certifications, where university can issue a certificate, say only Roop can, Roop was graded a university degree from Columbia University, but anyone can ask, did Rob get that university degree? And then there are the public permission, private permissionless permission blockchains, where only certain people can acquire a blockchain, but anyone can put information on a blockchain.
Well, thank you for that lesson. And my degree certificate certainly would say I failed the test. So looking at all of that, and I agree with you, there is a spectrum. Looking at all of that, which industries or verticals do you see aggressive adoption on? We've heard so many things, but what's really happening on the ground apart from just the media hype?
There is a lot of aggressive adoption at different stages. So fintech is definitely the most advanced, and definitely going to conferences like Money 2020 or Cybus, you hear, where's my deployment, which is very scary. Because if you think about it, last week I was in Singapore, I woke up to a tele interview, and the title of this interview was, are we ready for AI in enterprise or in business? And I said to my computer and I checked, when was the term artificial intelligence crafted? It was in 1956. So 16 years later, we are checking if we are ready for enterprise artificial intelligence. And then I walk into my conference and people are saying, are we ready for deployment in blockchain? After what? 5 years, 6 years, when we're talking about enterprise blockchain. So it is pretty scary that we are so much rushing into that deployment. On the other hand, I think healthcare, I think supply chain are very aggressive adopters of that domain. Something that is really, I think 2018 will be the year of massive adoption in proof of authorship, proof of ownership. I think advertisement is the next big thing. And European Union will see a lot of GDPR and blockchain.
Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Wick, this is a question for you. So we spoke about the aspect of public blockchains, but also that can be used as permission-based public blockchains, specifically for institutional or enterprise use cases. You want to share your thoughts on that?
Yes. I think that a lot of the use cases associated with private blockchain deployments, in my personal opinion, are non-starters. There is always the discussion of transacting, public information, private information over public chain. But you have to think that we send very sensitive data over public internet, and we manage to do that safely and securely. There are just some solutions that need to be given second thought, especially with regards to using private chains over public chains. I can speak from the work that we're doing. We actually have been able to convince the regulator that we can put sensitive information on a public blockchain. So this is sensitive financial information on a public chain, which we did. There are some things which work, some which don't. There are solutions such as Zcash and such as JP Morgan's Quorum, which will be application layers on top of private and public blockchains that can encrypt some certain information and allow certain participants to view certain things. I can't speak much for the supply chain side of stuff. I don't know too much about it. But I certainly think that in financial services, there is a case for using public and private chains.
So I'm curious, just to follow up on that, what was your experience working with the regulators in UK on this blockchain, public blockchain, and more of encrypted or more highly sensitive securities data on it?
To be honest, the FCA have been great. They've been really, really good with us. I have to say they're probably the most innovative British institution over the past year and a half, in my opinion. They've been planning the sandbox, they executed it. They are really looking for innovative projects in the UK, and we've been lucky enough to be the only company in both the first and second sandboxes. and they've given us access to their teams internally who write the rule book on regulations in the UK. And we've been able to have direct conversations with them, partly educating them about the technology we would like to use and partly being educated by them about why certain rules are in the rule book, and having a dialogue about how certain technology and the use of certain technology should fit into an existing framework, but also about how the existing framework may need to change slightly in the future to accommodate the use of new tech like blockchain.
That's interesting to know. I'm glad that they look at this as pushing the envelope on legal frameworks and innovation inside of that as well. We'll speak a lot more about that in the third round. Let me come to Jim on the aspect of public blockchains in the public health world.
Sure. So I do want to kind of make a comment. I think, it's important for all of us to be, especially, as pioneers in this space, and I think we pretty much are, in these early days, we need to be independent thinkers. So if you go and listen to IBM, the world will look like a private blockchain all day long. That's crap. That really is. You need to interrogate the business model, and you need to really separate, the hype and the marketing versus what really makes sense longer term. I'm a huge believer. Certainly, anything with the word public in it, public health, is a public business model, right? Do you start with private proof of concept? Yeah, because you need to learn, right? I talked to Steve back, like in January. Early days, we're doing this, and that's what we're doing. But does that mean that's the end of the road? Absolutely not. Yeah. And also, this is where I think the nuance, needs to be thought through, because, again, I see a world where we have to have like chain of chains. We have to have chains. Maybe a small private kind of proof of concept has to work in a larger context. So the way I see it, going back to your specific question, Roop, is that I see a permissioned public model being kind of like the default model in the long term for us. Mm-hmm. Because the world that we're in is public. Public health, not only is it public, but it's also global, right? It's unlimited by geography. If there's an infectious disease, that's going around, we're not limited by state of Georgia, right? Mm-hmm. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to trust everybody. In fact, it's the opposite. There are some very strict HIPAA rules in terms of data privacy. There's some strict rules. In fact, we have even more rules as a CDC in terms of data security, in terms of usage agreements for data. So all of that has to be complied to, right? But the technology is there, and even beyond some of the things we talked about in terms of, kind of the existing technologies, some emerging, really interesting technologies such as hash graphs, as an example. I have a team working on that right now. We're kicking on hash graphs from swirls because we see that there's ways to innovate so we kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Anyways, bottom line is I very much believe that it's got to be public in the long term. And then, again, outside of just CDC, if you look around, the federal government, believe it or not, has actually got a number, I think there's last count, at least 12 federal agencies are doing active blockchain initiatives, including GSA, if they can contract and put it there. And I think that's the model that people are thinking about. I just think that the issue here really is lack of skills, lack of kind of critical mass in actually building these things out. And oftentimes, we drink the Kool-Aid of, well, I'm listening to Microsoft, IBM, whoever happens to be, right? Mm-hmm. I'm not picking on any one. And that's their preference, right? That is their comfort zone. So therefore, I think we have to think a little bit deeper.
Yeah, thanks for saying that. So I think we definitely have to think about the business use case and the applicability of, should it be public or private, or it should be permission-based or permissionless, really is governed by the business use case. I think that's the highlight there. So let me ask the question this way. What obstacles do we need to remove to accelerate the adoption of blockchain solutions within the enterprise? Who wants to take that?
One of the biggest challenges I see is the fact that this isn't general SaaS, it's not general software as a service, right? I can't sell it to one entity and they get the full value of the blockchain and then sell it to another entity independently and they get the full value of the blockchain. You almost, in the use case of say finance or healthcare, you almost need an industry-wide implementation, which takes a very long, hard, coordinated process. And then within supply chain, I think supply chain is a fabulous opportunity for this technology, but you either need to find a company that's completely fully integrated, vertically integrated with their supply chain, or one that has enough control up and down the supply chain that they can say, this is the solution that we're going with. So you can't sell different services to different institutions. I think that's going to be one of the biggest barriers once we get beyond the battles, because traditionally, take the financial institution for a while. They realized that they could go very fast by themselves, right? Compete. We can go very far, very fast. But now what they're realizing and they're coming together is because if you want to use this technology, you got to work together, and you can go a lot further by working together. And I think that that's going to take some time in different industries. One of the biggest barriers to entry in the healthcare industry is that we don't have general codification across the country. Different medicines, different processes, all are represented differently. So you need to create a standardization so that you then have one system that people can operate with. So I think the fact that it requires broad implementation is one of the biggest barriers to entry right now.
Dr. Marta, I think you have something to add there.
Yeah, so I wanted to support what you just said. I think that there are three biggest issues that we see, and as Linux Foundation, we have exposure to 180 members now, all the way from big players like the IBM and Accenture and Deloitte, all the way to smaller companies, which means that it's a great ecosystem to experiment with those things. And there are three things. First, education. People and the players out there need to be educated and learn. And it is a huge learning curve for everyone, because the more you get involved with this space, the more you learn how little you know. And educating everyone, including yourself, is a very, very hard thing. And knowing where to start. Is it the 101 or is it higher level? And how to speak to everyone in a language that they understand and you understand yourself is a big problem. Second is promoting collaboration, because it's much more exciting to see fight for everyone than see everyone in the room sitting and collaborating. And unfortunately, for some reason, everyone's expecting everyone to fight. And we spend so much time fixing those problems. I'm constantly invited to the room and being asked the question, so, how are you solving this big issue of you fighting against Ethereum? How is Hyperledger fighting against Corda? And I'm saying, well, no, actually, I've been out for a coffee with Mike from R3, and I'm working with Vitalik. We are not competitive in any way. We are all trying to solve the problem because there is only so much fun you can have on a blockchain, which is a peer-to-peer network alone. Peers on a network. And this is how you work, and I want it. But for some reason, people are trying to be alone on this peer-to-peer network. So these are the biggest issues for adoption.
That's amazing. Thank you for saying that. There's only so much fun you can have on a peer-to-peer network by yourself. That's the highlight. Jim, you had a thought, and then we.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of, just as a comment to what Jack was saying. So I think counterintuitively, the government is a critical component of driving these ideas, like these large industries like healthcare and how to make blockchain happen. However, not in the way you may conceive. I'm not thinking regulations. I'm not talking about like meaningful use 3.5 to, for blockchain to be regulated. Yeah, I mean, that'll happen. To me, actually, it's much more so at the technology level and building out certain kind of frameworks or templates that then is funded by government. Now, let's take CDC as an example. So the majority of public health around, certainly the US, is funded by the CDC, right? That's how it's funded. So therefore, if we're the pioneers and leaders in blockchain, we come up with some useful, relevant, and kind of perhaps transformative solutions using blockchain. The fact that we can fund, and we do fund, highly influences the rest of the public health partner networks. To me, that's how you make the difference. We can come up with regulations all day long and nobody will buy into it. It'll take 10 years, right? But to me, that is a way of doing it. And I think this is where, again, goes back to the workforce issue and goes back to people like yourselves understanding where government fits in. And also, I know Randall runs the GBA here and the people who are interested in government, but actually really engaging with government and bringing innovative solutions, because if one or two of them strike, we can permeate. Like, just look at DARPA. Look at the amount, I don't know, you guys are probably familiar. DARPA spends an enormous amount of money leading innovation that in many, like the internet, that becomes things that we use, some of which we don't know about, right? So it's not unheard of that the government actually really leads this innovation. So I just think we need to make sure that when we think government, we're not just thinking regulations and legislation and rules and policies. I think there's more than that we can do that's actually more tangible.
Right. Well, thanks for shifting our perspective.
Can I chime in here?
Collaborative partner. Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Andrew.
Okay, well, first, lots of great comments here. I want to take a slightly contrarian view here just to make it interesting, but also because I believe what I'm about to say. The first is that that Nassim Taleb, in his book Anti-Fragile, has proposed some really interesting counters to the argument that government leads the way. That argument ignores the missing counterfactuals, all the things they invest in that bust. And it's much more, I'm not saying government doesn't play a role. I'm not saying education doesn't play a role, but there's a causation problem that a lot of people like to assume away, but it's not true. Technology evolves, lots of players are involved. It's a chaotic system. Because it's a chaotic system, it's impossible to say what causes what, and to do so is an error. The main point I wanted to make is that I think our main enemy here is time, and the main solution here is time. These aren't things that people like hearing, but that's the truth. We're too early. I know, being on a team, that there's just not enough developers out there that are really smart. And that's because it's really early. And it's really hard to find these people. So that's one bottleneck. The other bottleneck is entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs who actually understand the tech and are trying to push out a product that people want to use today. These are two things you just don't see a lot of. You see a lot of people talking about the potentials of the protocol. You got a lot of great guys at the protocol level, building the infrastructure that a lot of people at the academic level can look at and say, oh, in 5 years, in 10 years, this stuff is going to be really useful. But there's a big gap in there, which is entrepreneurs and developers. And that is where education and government come in and wind up playing a role. I just wanted to kind of flip it a little bit and highlight this serious bottleneck that you see on a team, which is developers and entrepreneurs looking to build who actually understand the technology. Most do not.
Yeah, thanks for emphasizing that. Dr. Vig?
Yeah, I was actually going to make 2 points, and Andrew covered that one, the last one about entrepreneurs. I completely agree with that. The number of people who come into these industries, just startups in general, who haven't got a clue what they're doing, they end up spoiling the broth for everybody. The second one, this might be a bit controversial as well. I think that one of the hindrances to innovation in general are innovation departments inside corporate. I think that a corporate trying to use an innovation department to look innovative and to push work through the company is a massive barrier. I think there are certain corporates who are trying to bring innovation throughout the entire organization. Rather than setting up innovation departments, they're ensuring that everybody in the company is responsible for doing something innovative. I think those are the corporates that are really going to encourage innovation in the future. But I think the ones who are opening innovation departments and labs and all this kind of stuff, I'm very, very, very skeptical about them. And I would just highlight one company such as JP Morgan. They haven't opened an innovation department. They are trying to push innovation within in every department, and they're doing very, very well.
Thanks. Innovation within enterprises or incumbent enterprises, that's one of my favorite topics to talk about. So we'll probably leave that for another time. I have a lot of contrarian views on that. Dr. Zhang, you had a point?
Yeah, I totally agree that many people raise about education. I think education is going to be a very important component of this innovation wave. We already see many companies trying to hire professionals in fintech, in blockchain, but it's very hard to find this kind of talent. So some universities are already taking the lead, like NYU, they already have MBA in fintech. They're trying to roll out undergrad in fintech. I think Georgia State is also trying to get more involved. We talked about that as well, and not only about the student, but also educating people from companies, entrepreneurs. Right? We can do all kind of jobs. I think that will be important part of this. Another thing is that when visit, because blockchain in its nature is kind of disruptive in many senses. It will disrupt the current order of business. So a lot of resistance will come from the incumbent companies. So we know that all the big banks are doing blockchain research and innovation. But one problem with that is whether they are willing to completely change their business model, or they are actually building up their patent pool, building up their intellectual property pool to fend off potential competitions. So I think that's an important issue, whether we want to, like we have enough startups or to disrupt the industry from outside, or is the competition strong enough to force the change of the industry?
Fair point. So talking about education, since you've heard everybody say that, Dr. Yang and I, we have been exploring this idea of producing blockchain boot camps. So we'll talk a little bit more about that afterwards. Let's pivot a little bit into the legal environment, and let's talk about smart contracts. Do you think that smart contracts will replace paper contracts in the legal system, and will the legal system actually adapt and innovate?
Guess that's for me, huh? I do. I mean, our firm, we're looking at it. Not going to say we've executed or assisted clients in executing smart contracts, but we're definitely interested in being forward thinking about how we can integrate those for the benefit of our clients. So I think that's coming. I think it's coming in some form in the next 12 months or so, and we're excited to see what happens. I mean, taking a step back to smart contracts, because I think that term often, at least the way I think about it, I think people talk about it in sort of two distinct buckets. You have the Ethereum-based smart contracts, which are just, Turing complete software that runs on top of their blockchain and can execute commands and functions. But when I think about smart contracts from a legal perspective, it's about taking those traditional paper documents that we all deal with, or their electronic versions, and taking what portions of those we can, and replacing obligations of parties to go do something with executable code that actually carries out that function. So low-hanging fruit obviously is making a payment, right? If one party owes the other payment, a party at the first of each quarter, you can do that automatically and not rely on that other party to actually click the send button. There's other areas. So I think it's going to be a progression, right? So I mean, in the short term, I think we'll start to make those sort of low-hanging fruit, easy parts of a contract smart. And then over time, we'll start maybe even reorganizing how we transact and how we contract so that more of it can be pushed to smart contracts. And, again, it's back to the theme of disintermediation. And in that sense, it's almost more than that. It's taking away the need to rely and trust your counterparty all the general, even without there being an intermediary there. So it's just further, governance through automated contracts and things of that nature.
Right. So, Dr. Wick, I know you guys operate in that space. If you think about smart contracts, and if you think about automating or just automating the business process, I see two steps here. One step that we're taking is just to automate the current business process, and then given the leverage we can get from blockchain and smart contracts, really redefining new business processes. How do you see that happening?
Yeah, so in our company, we're focused on three things: formation, performance, and enforcement of legal contracts. I think it's very important to understand, firstly, how to take existing contracts and digitize them, organize them, categorize them, and rank them. Then it's very important to understand how to create those contracts in a digital form, how to collaborate on them, and actually how to take the logic from those contracts and automate the enforcement of things that need to happen in a contract. This is where I think a smart contract can come into play. People are always asking, can a smart contract be legally recognized? I don't think that's necessarily the right question. I think the right question is, can all of the enforcement in a legal contract be automated first? Because if that can be done digitally, then potentially that could be done on smart contracts. I think the answer to that is it's a very difficult one to answer. There's a lot of things in legal contracts that can't be automated. At the end of the day, you need to have a lawyer doing certain things. We're very far from having a fully artificially intelligent solution to, creating and enforcing contracts. But I think as an intermediate step to get there, we should be looking more at automating legal and understanding the logic behind it first before talking about moving things into smart contracts. Remember, smart contracts are not smart and they're not contracts.
Interesting. So that means Austin still has a job for a few years.
So it's relief.
Awesome. So we're coming to the close of this round. We have time for one question, perhaps. Any burning desires? Wow. Virginia?
Yes. So we've heard a lot about the promise of blockchain technology. And Jim, you mentioned one thing that kind of relates to my question. How many government agencies are already looking at blockchain applications? And 95% of what I read is all about the promise of blockchain, but there is 5% out there that I read about the potential dark aspects, and quite honestly, some of those are rather frightening. So I wondered if anybody was interested in or willing to talk about some of the potential unintended consequences of blockchain technology.
Any takers? Oh, plenty. Okay, let's start with Jim.
So Virginia, I think one of the most important kind of unintended consequences is thinking everything is blockchain, because that isn't. There's distributed databases they can use to do loads of solutions. So I think that is a big thing, where you think, well, everything is a blockchain. It isn't, because it's a complicated thing and it's very difficult to get it right to begin with. So, I think we just got to think some things are just not blockchain.
So just to repeat the question for the folks online, she asked about the dark aspects of blockchain technology, and all we've heard so far, or largely, is the promise. Where are the results? I know Dr. Wick, you had your hand up, and then Andrew?
Yeah. What exactly are the dark aspects? Sorry. I wanted to ask the lady in the audience who asked that question, in her view, what are the negative things?
Well, I think that digital identity, the ability or inability to change that, to the extent that the blockchain is truly distributed, I think that does help minimize potential risks. But if it is controlled, if blockchain technologies are controlled by the government, it really could enhance their ability to control our behavior and invade our privacy.
Wonderful. So the question really is about control and then going into user privacy and security.
Is that more or less so than they are already doing? Another point on the distributed nature. So, many cloud systems are actually more distributed than private blockchain deployments.
Fair.
I found your response to what was dark very interesting. I was expecting to hear Silk Road and all the other stuff.
Exactly, true.
I will say this blockchain is terrifying to me. The implications, what can happen, what you see with the ransomware out there. That is fundamentally a superior technology taking advantage and being leveraged by criminals to attack weaker systems. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. But yeah, I mean, when I talk to people that are, have the libertarian viewpoint about Bitcoin and all of that kind of stuff, I remind them, I said that even if the base level protocol facilitated completely anonymous transactions, A government can say that every company that uses that blockchain must trace everything down to the Satoshi that happens and must collect a very strong government ID, keep that on record for 100 years, and we will trace every bit of activity that anybody transacts anywhere in the world down to one Satoshi, and it will be far superior to the level of tracking you have in the current banking system. It will be. We can do that, and we can do it efficiently. And the government could absolutely kind of force anybody who wants to transact to do that.
Interesting. Mitchell, and then Andrew.
So I was going to say something else, but just because Stephen kind of talked about the government tracing money, we have clients that get audited by the IRS. It's nice that they can't trace everything sometimes. For many people appreciate that. Especially those of you that haven't been reporting your capital gains and losses on your cryptocurrency. But that reporting will come 5 years, maybe less. But when I think about the smart contracts, what I often find myself doing is I consider what businesses today could totally be eliminated. What, unfortunately, human positions that we work, that people do, can be totally eliminated. And there's so many ways that the economy can run so more efficiently. Buying cars, but in order for that car title to transfer, today you've got people running around to courthouses and between different jurisdictions. Why can't that just sit on the blockchain, automatic, and have that smart contract take care of making sure that whatever fee has to get paid to the county for your tag, that gets done. Why even have a tag? Okay, just have your cars on the blockchain. You just need a little code. And I challenge each person to consider the 2 or 3 or 4 areas that you see how you can eliminate so much inefficiencies in our economy. And granted that some people are going to become financially successful from that. Some people are going to be like the carbon paper company, for those old enough to remember what carbon paper is, to be out of business. And these changes are going to happen. Some of them involve public-private, the government and private industry. For something like one example I just gave, they've got to actually agree and end up collaborating on that. But there's so many examples that we'll see wonderful solutions coming out of blockchain and solving a lot of business problems today that just take too long.
Yeah. So there are a few business ideas for you if you were looking for them. Give me 1 second.
I've got a patent on everything I just said.
It's on the record. We can put this on the blockchain now. Andrew, I know you've been waiting.
Yeah, so I'm going to give 2 responses because we just kind of touched. My cat really wants to get on screen.
The cat's name.
I just want to highlight a point that Vic kind of touched on, which is 100% right. That guy is super bright. Everybody on the panel, super bright. But I highly recommend people start differentiating between smart contracts and contracts that are on a blockchain and are automated and are intelligent, and we're doing awesome things with them on the blockchain. Smart contracts, I'll say it here now, are probably the most overhyped element of blockchain technology right now. They're great. They're going to be around for a long time. They're not the solution everybody thinks they are. I can do lots of amazing things with contracts right now, automated on blockchains without using a single a single smart contract. A big innovation that's going to happen in the near future around this are something called oracles, which are a human layer that integrates with blockchains that'll help resolve some of these issues. I want to get back to the dark issues around blockchain. There are certainly many. These are going to spur a lot of innovations in the blockchain, right? Because potential problems fuel potential solutions. As far as the makeup of all of these teams, if you're afraid of government having control over your life, we're your only hope. That's the reality. That's just, we made money without central banks or governments. You're welcome.
Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on smart contracts. So, BitPay, at BitPay, we execute approximately 10,000 smart contracts every day. And so we did take a look at the question of running a smart contract on a blockchain. And we concluded that it makes absolutely no sense. A contract, if you think about it, a contract has an element of trust involved in it, right? The counterparties in the contract are trusting each other to some degree. There's some enforcement, some kind of enforcement that forces those counterparties to behave. And think about what blockchains do. They reduce or eliminate the need for trust. So to the extent you're successful in doing that, you don't need contracts. However, I said that we execute about 10,000 smart contracts a day. Those contracts are the form of a merchant wants to collect a certain amount of money. We say that if a certain amount of Bitcoins arrive at a certain address within a certain period of time, we'll send you that money tomorrow. Those contracts themselves are between us and our merchants. They're automated. They're not executing in a blockchain, but they are using a blockchain, namely the Bitcoin blockchain. So I see the role of blockchains and smart contracts is not so much the contract executing in the blockchain, but software interfacing with different blockchains.
Fair point. So we are running behind time, but I will take one question. Gentleman in the back.
Actually, this is more of a comment. From a legal standpoint, one question is, can you contract electronically? And the answer to that is yes, you can. And that was decided in the law before the introduction of the internet commercially. It's been around for a long time. Second question is, can you contract electronically? The answer to that question is yes, you can. And that's been the case since about year 2000 in the United States. The next question is, can your refrigerator contract for you? And the answer is no, because they're not a person. They're never going to be a person, but you can authorize your refrigerator to contract on your behalf.
Interesting.
So the legal issues related to smart contracts actually are more likely to be, we've got this smart contract and there's an error or there's a bug. And what do we do with that and how do we handle that? And there's going to be some movement in the law in that area, but there's actually a lot of this stuff that's already been very well settled for a very long time.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. I think we'll get into a lot more complexities when we widen this ecosystem to not just blockchain, but you include artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, virtual reality, augmented reality, and smart contracts, and then things become a lot more interesting. So we are a little bit behind, just a few minutes. So let's go ahead and take a really quick 5-minute bio break, and if you can come back by, let's say, 5:13, we can get started. Well, thank you for coming back. So we have discussed the evolution of Bitcoin and blockchain technology. We have ventured into enterprise use cases, specifically on supply chain, public health, media, etc. And we have also, if you could settle down, please. Thank you. We have also gotten into some dark aspects. So the next round is about your favorite topic. That's why you came here for, right? That's everything is just extra. It's about ICOs. So let's take a quick poll in the room. Do you believe ICOs are flights of fancy? They're closest to scams that we've ever seen? Or do you believe they're genuine interruption and disruption of the venture capital industry? So please raise your hand if you think the first, that they're scams. Okay?
Scams or both.
Or both. Okay? They're both, okay? And do you, please raise your hand if you believe that they are the best thing that happened to us to evolve in our human race. Okay, some people think that, very few though. Okay, well that sets the stage for our next segment. Let's look at some data. More VC firms are investing in cryptocurrencies, hedge funds, ICOs, and tokens directly now. On a quarterly basis, total funds raised by ICOs surpassed total funds raised via traditional equity financing for the first time in Q2 of 2017. The growth rate for equity deals and VC-backed deals is slower than the growth rate for ICOs. there remains to be concern on ICO teams' overcapitalization and also not really producing products, and in fact not even be responsible to produce products from the funds that they have raised. So I'm going to go around the roundtable here and ask our panelists, what is your position on ICOs generally speaking? Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Okay, go.
So the irony of venture capital is that we invest billions of dollars a year to change the way industries operate, but ours remains largely unchanged. The biggest challenges in venture are that it's an incredibly illiquid asset class, and you only ever get a return if the company succeeds, either gets acquired or has an exit or goes public. This model of fundraising of initial coin offerings is a fantastic opportunity for everyday individuals to participate in new opportunities, new ventures, and it's an incredible way to change the way venture capital operates. However, there are a lot of lessons to be learned right now. We're an early stage venture fund focused on the blockchain, and we've not yet invested in an ICO. We think that there's a lot of challenges, and the biggest one I think is that people are confusing raising a successful round and starting a successful company. There's companies out there that do not have either the technical talent or the industry knowledge in order to operate the business that they're trying to operate. Right now, these companies are able to raise so much money because the blockchain enthusiast ecosystem is excited about the use cases that these people are going after, and so they're throwing a bunch of capital behind it. But what's going to happen is we're going to get a lot of noise in the ecosystem as more blockchain companies come in and more traditional companies start to leverage the blockchain and do these initial coin offerings. So ultimately, I think that these ICOs, the fundraising model of having your future users pay you to be a part of your service is an incredible thing. I think that it's going to move from the seed stage funding of Series A and seed and Series A into the growth stage funding. So imagine if, for example, Uber had a token. They started in Chicago, they validate their business, they go to New York, they see that they have a product market fit, and now it's time to go to Boston, San Francisco, LA, Houston, Austin, Dallas, and Atlanta. If they do an initial coin offering at that point, they are getting buy-in from their future users. Their future users are being rewarded because there's a fixed supply, and as more people in those areas join on, the value of the currency increases. So to sum it up really quickly, I think it is a fundamental game changer to venture. I think it's great for venture capital, and I think it's great for the everyday individual that would not have access to these companies at such an early stage. But be skeptical and be cautious about what you're participating in, and wait, I think, for the lessons learned of this first wave.
Right. So as a consulting firm, we see some of the similar issues coming from people who are maybe not very well educated on how the technology works, just want to raise a few funds, and also from the lack of ownership in terms of, well, we have to actually produce a product at some point, you know. So let me bring in some other folks here. Stephen?
Yeah, so I think it's both. You know, there are a lot of scams out there, and there are also some legitimate companies being started and finding, you know, this to be a very effective fundraising model. The question is, why is it so effective compared to traditional fundraising models? I think it's just the inefficiencies of the traditional fundraising models is also the regulations around traditional fundraising models. When you buy an ICO token, what investor rights do you have? You know, that's a big question that anybody buying these should be asking. So I think it's a better platform for keeping track of a cap table, for sure, and trading equities and trading ownership of those equities. But the reason it's so successful is it's open to everybody, and it's not restricted the way, you know, when BitPay goes out and raises funding, you know, we have to make sure they're an accredited investor. There are a lot of restrictions on that equity fundraising. What's going on in the ICO marketplace, there are either no regulations or they're just ignoring the regulations. And I would argue that the fact that it's running on top of a blockchain instead of an Excel spreadsheet makes absolutely no difference as far as regulations are concerned.
Thank you for saying that. I think that's an interesting point. Let me bring in Mitchell on some regulatory aspects of ICOs.
Sure. So I would agree that you've got some bad characters out there that have done some inappropriate actions relative to ICOs, but there's some great uses out there. I'm actually less of a fan of unaccredited investors actually buying into ICOs versus accredited investors, because I don't think that the unaccredited investor mostly understands. Actually, most accredited investors don't understand what they're buying also. You could be buying stock on the stock exchange or a token from a company doing an ICO. Most people, as sophisticated as they may feel they are, have no idea really what they're investing in. So it is really not that different from that regard. I know Austin's going to talk more about the legal aspects of it. What we're seeing is a lot of folks doing ICOs overseas. They're getting advice from tax advisors and attorneys overseas, but they're not getting advice from U.S. counsel. So U.S. tax advisors, U.S. attorneys, so they may be U.S. citizens or U.S. residents going overseas to conduct a token sale. They have no clue, and they're not getting advised. You're seeing more people getting advice now, but they're not getting advised on what's the impact to you as a U.S. resident or citizen actually doing this. So there are a lot of tax issues around how you actually can, and if you do a token sale one way or another, what the tax ramifications are. But we are continuing to see more and more activity in this route of funding. Now, somebody made the comment about sort of the cap table. Well, if the three of us up here decided to do an ICO and raise $50 million, we still own 100% of the company. And if that company can be more than just the token sale, there's actually some future value there. And I know in some respects, a lot of business plans are, we're just doing the token sale to create this platform so it's open source and that's it. The equity may not really have value at that point. It may just be the tokens that are going to be trading, or the cryptocurrency that's just going to pay the three of us salary for however many years it lasts. However, the companies that are doing token sales that are actually thinking more like a venture-backed company, that they're essentially pulling in money before they have a product, to build the product, to then create additional revenue stream on top of what the tokens are actually going to create, would have more opportunity for the owners or the founders of that company to have some value. And then, of course, you run into the case of, if I did it through a foundation, do I even have control? Who has the control, and the tax and legal issues dealing with if I'm using a domestic or a foreign foundation? That poses all kinds of other risks associated with a business that you're the founder, but you don't have control over your assets, your IP. So I'll stop there. I can keep going, but
I'll ask you a follow-up question. How about that? So let's say I want to start or launch an ICO, initial coin offering, and I am a U.S. citizen, and I want to set up a foundation, and maybe I want to do this because somebody told me it's better to do it in Estonia or Switzerland. What are the tax implications of that? And then we'll come to Austin for the legal implications.
So the U.S. tax implications, we'd start with, is there IP that you've already created? Now, you might tell me there's just a white paper. You might tell me that you've been working on some code on your nights and weekends because you've got some full-time job somewhere. But let's assume that there's some level of intellectual property that you've created here as a U.S. resident. Now, you want to go ahead and transfer that overseas. The question is, what type of legal entity are you transferring it to? Are you transferring it to, in the case you use the foundation, and do I in effect have control over that foundation? Because some folks will tell you, no, I don't have control, there's a board in place, but rubber hits the road, we find out you actually have total control. You've got the wallet to the cryptocurrency right here on your phone. No one else has that. You've got it, and you're sitting here in the US. So that potential, those proceeds that came into that foreign foundation, even though in your mind you've set up what you were told is a nonprofit foreign foundation in Estonia, what you may have for US purposes is actually a controlled foreign corporation. You just don't know it because you didn't get advice from a US advisor. And so you may have taxation as a result of that. You may have taxation as a result of transferring intellectual property outside the United States without reporting it. You have to deal with reporting on to the IRS that you have foreign assets, foreign bank accounts, or foreign wallets in this case. And you just have to plan. So we've gotten involved with several transactions where we're helping people that did these foreign
foundations, and we're helping them figure out, we're not unwinding any of them. We're actually showing them how you can actually work with that foreign entity, with a U.S. entity, with interplay of what we call transfer pricing, to be able to operate that business in a way. What you want to attempt to avoid happening is the IRS taking a position that the foreign foundation is doing business in the United States or is a controlled foreign corporation. Those are two aspects that you need to try to avoid if possible. And if not, you're actually better off just doing a US ICO.
So the answer is it's complicated.
I could have said that to you. Sorry I didn't say that. If you want to hear more, I can talk for hours about this.
We appreciate it. Austin, you want to speak to legal implications?
Sure. And before jumping straight into that, I mean, I think something that that Mitchell highlighted actually is an interesting misnomer around this ICO space, where he's talking about how, yes, you're not selling equity, but you might be handing over, most of what the value of that company is in the form of a product. So I think there's the visceral reaction to some of the money being raised by these ICOs, coupled with no equity changing hands, fails to appreciate that fact that a lot of these models, you're giving you're in a sense to some degree giving up the equity in the product and retaining your participation rights in its economic upside as the primary token holder, and then that drives demand, and the value created by the ecosystem being created is driven to the token and whoever holds it. So I don't think that's confusion in this room, but I think that's a common thing that people think. And I think the reaction to they just raised $200 million without giving up equity leads to some reactions that are misinformed and perhaps negative as a whole. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, and when we're talking about ICOs and token sales, the main one outside of the tax implications is the application of securities laws, particularly U.S. securities laws. And this, the theme of Beyond Blockchain 101, we won't delve into the Howey test. To anyone that's sort of looked around the space has probably heard or read the DAO guidance. But, and first a couple disclaimers. As an industry, legal in general, and I'm not a securities lawyer by background. I've learned more than I ever thought I would in the last 6 months. We've got securities-focused attorneys looking at these things, but we're kind of doing some educated guessing as an industry. I mean, we're trying to apply old rules that don't fit new tech very well, and assign probability ratings of something being classified as a security. And I think interestingly, the sentiment of that seems to have shifted to be more conservative as opposed to more aggressive. And I actually would have suspected the opposite, given that all we've really gotten out of the SEC is the DAO guidance, which I don't think was particularly informative. I think everyone kind of thought that was a security. Yep. We don't have good guidance on a lot of these companies claiming to be utility tokens and where the SEC views that. And so, we're working with the rules and the case law we have to make any ICO before the product is actually usable, the token is usable in connection with the product, is by definition of security. I don't feel the need to make that leap, but I think that definitely, if you can have a built product, you're in a much better shape from a regulatory perspective. And going back to, things moving sort of more aggressive, and, we're talking about a 6-month timeline here, but my perception of, more aggressive skating around the securities laws to less aggressive than now, I think part of that is you've seen some more innovative structures emerge for this that contemplate, and a couple of them contemplate a smaller round or an initial round with accredited investors that's done as a registered exempt securities or exempt securities offering with a follow-on, and use that money to fund the development. And there's been the SAFT structure, the simple agreement for future tokens. I recently read about someone proposing a FACT structure, which is this idea that you give out equity in connection with the raise, but then you issue the token as a dividend. And so there's some different things people are trying to come up to work within the existing framework. And so, I mean, at the end of the day, if you want to take away of the safe way to go about doing a regulated ICO, it's until you've built it, for starters, you're better off with some sort of exempt offering, whether it's going traditional financing or going a SAFT note through accredited investors only as an exempt offering, and then building the product. And if you feel comfortable that you're still in the utility token model and your token isn't, if your token's shooting back dividends or profit sharing interests, or there's some sort of formal buyback program like that that just makes it look a lot like stocks and things like that, then you're probably on the wrong side of the curve, and you're going to need to account for the securities laws at all times. But if you're issuing what it actually is, a utility token, which maybe starts to look more like a prepaid access to use of a technology-based service as opposed to equity in a thing, and you issue it after it's ready to be used. I mean, you might have a pipeline for additional development to do it, but that's probably your best position. I mean, acknowledging a lot of companies need funding to get to the built model, and I think that's where we'd encourage you to look at the sort of more exempt offering structures that have emerged before going with a full crowd sale.
Right.
How do foundations play into that? Sorry.
Well, so, I mean, that kind of gets into the nature of offshore securities issues. And I think that's a good point because you've got a lot of these major ones. I think Tezos and EOS both blocked US IP addresses. In talking with our securities attorneys, they feel like that's not adequate to get the benefits of effectively a Reg S exempt offering or an offering that's outside of the purview of the SEC. If because we all know that it doesn't take much to tunnel in around an IP block to a VPN or something like that. And so it's that SEC hasn't weighed in, but it but so a lot of the offshore structuring. One, I think it's heavily driven by taxes, but to the extent it's driven by securities. I mean, yeah, if you go offshore, take the operations offshore, the issuance offshore, and do not sell to U.S. investors, the U.S. government has no jurisdiction over you. But that's really hard to do, especially in an open crowd sale type model.
Right. So, Stephen?
I actually had a question. Is there any way that you can, for any ERC20 token, argue that it is in any way a utility token? Because the only thing you can do with an ERC20 token is manage the ownership and transference of that token, in which case it has to be some kind of contract. It has to represent a unit of some kind of contract. I don't see any way that you could argue that it is anything other than that.
I mean, I see what you're saying from the perspective of that token sitting on the Ethereum blockchain. I could see arguments being made that using that token in connection with a service and it having functions within that. I mean,
but what's the service? I mean, at best you can say it transfers over into some token that has a use value at some point in the future, in which case it's a contract.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, let's use storage. That's not the best. I think it looks more like a medium exchange. But the argument would be that that token is the exclusive means of access to that marketplace, and that's its utility. I think, there's, again, some of these arguments are weak, and that's why, that might be in part why we've seen a more push towards more conservative, analysis of the application of the securities laws to these things.
So we have been looking at evaluating some of these crypto companies
Martin's trying to say something.
I just wanted to...
Go ahead, Dr. Martin.
One thing that, something that you just mentioned, which is that before we had ICOs, we had venture capital firms, and startups were financed without ICOs. So I kind of am surprised when companies today say, oh, we need to launch an ICO without any viable product because we don't have a way to finance ourselves. Well, there are ways to do it.
Yeah, and the challenge they're seeing right now, sorry, there's a speaker. The challenge that they're seeing right now is it's incredibly difficult to raise capital. If you've ever started a startup, you email 1,000 investors, you get 100 replies, you take 100 meetings, you get one yes.
Yes.
It's not just like the process and the time. That's like, there's no separation between your company and who you are. So as people tell you no, it's incredibly difficult on who you are as well. And so you see these founders that are out there saying, it's not that there's no way, it's just a very difficult way. And so now they're seeing the community so willing to throw capital that they're like, well, we have to do it this way because it's the easiest thing. But I think that with unsophisticated investors, people that are not looking at the baseline of this technology and how it's being applied and what they're doing and really analyzing the team and these different factors that traditional venture capitalists use, I think having it move to a later stage de-risks the investment for the everyday individual. So I think venture capitalists will still ultimately play a role, and then it'll move back to a less risky investment. But you're right, there are other ways.
Right. So the role of venture capitalists has probably shifted. Dr. Wick, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'll just try to keep this brief. I think ICOs will not replace any form of venture capital. I think venture capital is very important. It has a strategic purpose for being there to fund businesses. You bring on investors who strategically align with you, who understand your business, who conduct due diligence. And if you actually are able to get their investment, that means you've passed a certain set of stringent checks that you needed to undergo to ensure that you have a business model, you have a plan, you can be a profitable company in the future, or you can grow a company. There are also angels, so don't forget, you can't just skip to going to VC funding. There are also angels. So you normally go to an angel, a bunch of angels, then you go to VC, and you have series of funding. on the topic of securities, I think what we're going to see in my personal opinion, and in our company's opinion, ICOs are going to be, I think 99% of ICOs are going to be classified as either securities or commodities. This is already beginning to happen, and we've been seeing this happen for a while now. Up to date, most of the ICOs that have been conducted have been done to leverage regulatory arbitrage. So they have been conducted to gain money without having to adhere to any kind of regulation or law, and there's a lot of tax that needs to be paid out on these things. There's a lot of regulators are going to come knocking on the doors of ICOs, and they're already doing that now, asking where's the money, where have you done due diligence, where have you actually adhered to the law and the regulation. I think thinking that ICOs are going to replace traditional funding or their new type of funding, I think that's a bit of wishful thinking and maybe not understanding of what securities actually are.
Interesting. So we have been developing a model in-house for evaluating crypto companies, which could be used for pre-ICO or post-ICO. And these regulatory factors play a huge part in that evaluation. And I agree with Dr. Wick when they say that at some point, a regulator will start knocking on your door and you just have not done enough due diligence. So let me get to that point. Practically speaking, what is the cost and timeline of this regulatory compliance? The question for an entrepreneur is, well, can I get away with it now, or should I wait for it later? Or if I can't get away with it, how do I actually do it so that I don't have to invest that much time and, in fact, cost on it now? That's the juxtaposition they live in. So, Mitchell and Austin, anyone wants to jump on the cost and timeline?
I'm trying to understand the question.
What is the cost and timeline of regulatory compliance for an ICO?
For an ICO. We're seeing the cost being definitely in the $500,000 range. Some a little lower, some a little higher, closer to $1 million in some cases. There's the time. What we're seeing is somewhere around 3 to 4 to 5 months, which is generally not too dissimilar from somebody going through a search for venture capital. And regulatory, I'll let Austin comment on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think a lot of these are shaping up that way. I mean, I think a lot of the international structuring component adds complexity and cost, so that's a big driver. I mean, I think I'm guessing if you were doing a straight U.S. sale without worrying about that, that number would come down. In your opinion, yeah. I mean, and then from a legal perspective, I mean, comparing it to traditional, it just depends, right? All these projects look different. They all have their different complexities. Some are very sort of simple and straightforward and fit nicely in a little box that everyone's comfortable with, and some are novel and new and ask all kinds of crazy securities questions and commodities regulation questions. Money transmission is an area that comes into play that people aren't talking a lot about here that I think is going to become an issue to navigate for a lot of these issuers. But from a timeline perspective, a lot of it, the international structuring slows things down. I mean, I think a lot of the benefit too is how quickly you can move absent that kind of thing though too as well. To do it regulated, you fit in one of the traditional exemptions, most likely a Reg D, a Reg A plus, Reg S offering. There's certain filing requirements, certain disclosure requirements, and so that starts to look a lot like the traditional world. On the pure token sale model, there aren't. If you're doing token sale, you say it's not a security, then there's not a whole. You're not going to go jump through SEC's hoops at that point. And so, largely at that point, you just got a contractual relationship with the buyer. And so anyone who's been in an ICO or participated in one's probably seen the terms of token sale document that are this, in my opinion, awkward hybrid of a commercial transaction document and a securities offering document where it says, not a security, not a security, not a security. Here's risk factors. Here's use of proceeds. Here's overview of management. All these things we never do in non-securities offering documents or commercial, agreements. And so, but that's emerged as best practices. And you've got names like Coinbase and Consensus putting their names behind that model. And so that's what's become. And it's safer to follow suit sometimes and do something different from the crowd. But it really depends. I mean, the Reg A or a fully registered offering can take, that alone can be $500,000 in legal fees, and then including ongoing because of the ongoing filing and disclosure requirements. And that can take half a year itself. So it really just depends on where you want to fit in the ecosystem. I mean, anything from a US-based, who cares what my tax liability is, who cares what securities law are, let's crowd sale next week, is technically doable, but you got to question whether or not you're, and this doesn't even count for PR and marketing, which, again, I think, it's rambling here, but to tie this all in, that worked in May, and that worked a little bit in June.
Yeah.
And people with a white paper could raise millions of dollars without much more. The market's a little bit self-regulating in the sense that those projects are having a lot harder time finding money, and they want to see a team, they want to see it built out more, proof of concept.
Right.
And so I think the market's maturing a little bit on its own just by, there's only so much money to go around, and now there's 5+ ICOs a day, and so the people that have the money are being more selective.
Right. So I think it's clear the days of 2 men in writing a white paper, or 2 women for that matter, writing a white paper are over. We have to do a lot more work.
Well, it depends on the 2 people.
Interesting.
Steve, you do it.
Go ahead, Stephen.
It reminds me of the South Sea Bubble. Do people know that history? So the South Sea Bubble was sort of this South Sea company that was a public-private partnership that issued like shares, and it was wildly successful initially, and then everyone copied it. And they were doing all kinds of ridiculous kind of company projects and creating and issuing shares and all this kind of stuff. And it just got way overblown, way overhyped. Everything was going fantastic until one day it all came crashing down completely. People were ruined, and then all sorts of regulations followed in behind that. And that was really the start of like public equities markets and how it got developed. So I would actually say that I think what we're doing, what's happening right now in the ICO marketplace is it's very similar to what happened with the South Sea Bubble. I think we'll see, corrections in the market, and I think we'll see all kind of, a lot of the early kind of scam things go away. I think people will figure out regulations, and this will be the beginning of something that does actually, I would disagree. I say it is, I think it actually will disrupt, venture investment and venture capital and growth equity.
Interesting. Mitchell, you had a question?
I was going to make a few comments. It already is disrupting the venture capital market, huge. A couple of thoughts if you're thinking about doing an ICO. You definitely want to make sure that you are thinking about knowing your customer. And what the law is, whether you do it here or domestically, Austin and his partners can tell you more about it. However, you need to go through and make sure you're concerned that you're not taking money in from terrorists. It's actually against the law. Or from people from certain countries, maybe Iran, North Korea, Venezuela. So it's important to recognize that whether it's a security or not, you still have to conform with these money laundering rules that exist in the U.S. We talked about whether the money that's taken in is considered a security or not, and I know you've heard reference to that. The collection, the sale of tokens is actually taxable income. So even if it's a security, it's still considered taxable income because you're not selling an equity interest for tax purposes. And the IRS has not ruled on how accounting should be done for tax purposes for token sales. We've taken a position that we believe it is going to be similar to what cryptocurrencies are and Kickstarter campaigns, where essentially you're pre-selling the right for people to use that technology, and then that would be taxable income. Of course, the IRS in 2014 came out with their rules on cryptocurrencies. That's really been the only advice that they've given, and we've taken positions for our clients based on that, and we've evolved that to address tokens and the token accounting issues. And I just want to make sure you realize it's very complicated, and if the Republicans have their way, the tax rate might be a lot lower next year, but there's also some negatives in there that could affect the tax strategy around token sales. So it just, the tax laws being proposed right now could have a positive and negative impact on anyone looking to do a token sale. So the international rules will greatly impact anyone trying to do anything offshore, and just make sure you're getting the right advice before you jump in.
Thank you. Dr. Young?
Yeah, I kind of also think ICO is both ways. There are a lot of maybe some kind of bubble, like South Sea bubble or internet bubble going on recently. So as time goes on, the companies that do not have product or do not produce will die, and people will find out will be more rational in the future. And also, I think it is a new paradigm because it allows a lot of much larger base of investors to invest in. That's a new model. But we also need other more higher level due diligence to help those investors. So some kind of new platform may arise. Maybe there will be analysts of ICOs, right, who provide information to investors. There will be institutional investors guiding individual investors, right? You may invest in an ICO fund. So all kind of interesting things can happen over time.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of innovation there. You mentioned a few things, and I think came up in quite a few conversations here. So apart from just the white paper, I think there are a number of factors we look at when we want to assess a crypto company or an event called the ICO. Namely being product itself and what kind of network effect is it potentially utilizing in the ecosystem. Is it really regulatory compliant based on the sector it's planning to enter, and also the country that it's based out of, and also the country that it is attempting to sell to. So regulation being undefined in a lot of the places, or maybe not supportive in a lot of the places, that complicates the matter further. So I have a question for you guys on thinking about it in a reverse way and just perking the room up a little bit. I think everybody's very depressed now. So what can an entrepreneur do to help increase the valuation in a way, or the raise of their ICOs? What are the right steps to take?
Before I get into that, I kind of want to go back a little bit, but it'll dovetail into that question. I think there's kind of a fallacy that might be at the root of kind of the type of analysis that's being applied, which is that I think we're losing sight of the fact. I mean, I do agree with the person who just said that, we're in a bubble. What does that mean? We've got this open platform for raising capital that's extremely cheap. Yes, there are ways of doing it that are expensive, but the average cost of an ICO, I don't know what it is. Anybody can do it poorly, very cheaply, or do it correctly, expensively. There's all kinds of variation. We're too early in this technology. 99% of the companies that ICO are not going to exist in 2 years. So if we're applying this broad-based analysis where we're looking at the entire field and going, what does this mean? We're looking at 99% dead companies. So to me, the much more interesting question is, well, which ones are going to survive? And it's, in my opinion, it's ones that leverage this technology to offer these assets in a way that doesn't make them securities. These are the best companies. They're offering real products where the token fuels the product, utility tokens. And we really need to narrow our focus and look at that and analyze from that point, as opposed to looking at an entire field of, frankly, dead companies. They're dead men walking. So I think that's one important distinction. As far as what can the entrepreneur do to maximize the value of their token, build a real product, have a user interface. There's none out there. It's ridiculous. We're the only application, we're the only real application that real people use, and we're dumbfounded. We look around and we're like, we're ashamed of our field, because everybody is so high in the clouds trying to develop protocols that will be useful 5 years from now, and they're not actually meeting consumer demand right now. It's easy enough. We've got a miraculous technology, magic internet money. You can use it. It's great.
Thank you, Andrew.
Sure.
So let's take a poll on that. Go ahead, Dr. Marta.
It's Marta, really. So that's something that I also wanted to voice, which is we really are so focused on blockchain and forget that blockchain is just part of a solution, not the solution. And we need to remember that blockchain is the back end, not the front end. We need front ends that will cover this amazing technology, and we need clicks and pretty good UIs that will enable people to start using this technology. And how do we enable mass adoption? How do we make people actually use this amazing technology? By making it pretty. And this will higher ICOs and higher money, and everything will be better.
Awesome. Thank you. Hold on one second.
Just a comment. So, for those of you guys who may have taken the time to look at any one of these white papers out there, I mean, I dare say, and see, probably nobody in this room, including me, really understands the math, the computational rigor that's in there. Okay? So, and I want to go back to Dr. Marta's point.
Just Martis.
Yeah, you can look at these things all day long, and I mean, unless that's your specialty, you'd be nothing other than confused. But if you try to distract the noise, right, the solutions are much simpler, right? And the solutions are, like, I give you an example. Let's take healthcare and blockchain. I mean, it's kind of solution du jour, right? Everybody wants to do patient record management, patient to everybody, right? But let's think about where the data is coming from. Right. Unless you can de-silo data from the literally tens of thousands of systems and have some way of having a authentic and referenceable pointer on the blockchain, right? You're not actually doing that much. So I think, I'm a big believer in that. I mean, we can kind of like nickel and dime about what is the very best technology and, whatever, but oftentimes the solutions, it's just a component of a much bigger thing. Right. And then when I look at it, to me, and I'm by no means an ICO expert or anything like that, I just look at the team and their runway outside of the very specific thing they're trying to sell. Right? I mean, great, hash graphs looks fantastic. How am I going to use it? So,
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And I agree with you that, and with Marta as well, that blockchain is essentially the underlying infrastructure technology, and there has to be a lot more around it to, in fact, move the needle on developing a product that is mass adopted. So quick points from Jack, and then we'll get into a Q&A session.
2 quick points. One is that, yes, 90% of startups broadly, generally speaking, fail. Just because you're using blockchain doesn't mean you're going to be successful. What that means, though, is that there's going to be an incredible amount of development talent coming back into the ecosystem. And that's what I think is going to be most exciting about this correction, is that then these companies that are starting to gain traction, they're going to have a much broader pool to hire from. That's amazing. What should these startups be doing, these blockchain companies that are doing initial coin offerings be doing? Follow traditional startup methodology. Build a product, test the hypothesis, reiterate, grow, build, and then launch your ICO after that. Just because you're using blockchain does not mean you're any different than any other startup. Stephen?
Yeah, think about it from this perspective. How many people know what the DTCC is? Okay, a handful. So the public equities markets are still built around this concept of paper certificates, believe it or not, and the DTCC kind of manages all that. It's like a central point of failure in the whole. When you go to E-Trade and buy a stock, E-Trade really doesn't hold that share. There's all kinds of counterparty risk that goes all the way back to the DTCC that sort of centralizes the actual paper. That system is ready to be disrupted, and I think the ICOs are the path to that. You can think of holding, I always think about, wouldn't it be great if somebody could come to BitPay's website, buy their shares in our stock right from the website, have it in their BitPay wallet, and then if they want to trade it, they take that share and they send it up to Coinbase, and then they can trade it on Coinbase. And then when they're done trading, they can withdraw whatever shares or equities back to their BitPay wallet. And then, if I'm not comfortable securing it in my wallet, then I can maybe trust some company to kind of take custody of it on my behalf. I think that's where all of these ICOs are ultimately going to lead.
That's exciting. So let me ask you a follow-up. How many years till we get that?
Oh, I don't know.
5, 10, 20?
Yeah, maybe 10.
Cool. So how many of you think what Andrew said, 99% of companies launching ICOs or have launched in the last 3 years are going to vanish, eliminated, die?
Probably more than 99%,
wow, majority of the room.
Really.
Thanks, Andrew. Let's open the panel up for a few open questions here for the whole 3 rounds. Go ahead, please.
A couple of questions. For the CDC gentleman, can you share with us a couple use cases that the CDC is thinking about for blockchain? And then for the rest of the panelists, including the VC gentleman, what are business models for entrepreneurs to monetize their blockchain startup? So if I were to launch a blockchain startup away from a virtual currency, how do I make money if I'm cutting the middleman? How do I monetize it?
Right. So just to repeat two questions. One is what are the use cases for CDC in terms of blockchain? The second is what are the business models that the entrepreneurs can use if they're actually disintermediating the supply chain and cutting the middleman? How do they monetize their product? So let's start with Jim.
So actually, we have a lot more than a couple. We have at least 8 that we've been kicking around, where we're doing a proof of concept right now in 2 of them. You may have seen in some of the articles about the emergency response use case, right? So we already have mobile technologies that we use, for instance, at Harvey, right? And we send a support pod, and these group of volunteers largely are there to support, people in need. But the issue is this. Oftentimes we need to dispense medicine, right? So to dispense medicine, we need to dispense the correct medicine in the right dosage to the right people, right? We can't just give willy-nilly medicine. So that is actually a kind of a complex issue because we need to know who the person is, what the biomarkers are. Long story short, that is one use case we're looking at with blockchain being the back end and our existing, going back to Dr. Marta's point, our existing mobile technology, the front end. Except now, instead of having people putting in information, we scan a QR code, right, to either for identification or in terms of dosage, and then all of it goes into this blockchain that's available to everyone to look. That's one. There's another one we're kicking around, which is all to do with information supply chain for essentially data that becomes public data, public statistical data for archival purposes on our public website. Right. We have another one around, and this is one of our more ambitious ones, around tracking opioids, real-time opioids, which is a huge issue. And we're looking at it right now more from like a debt certification perspective, extracting information there. And then there's many other systems we can tie into, which goes back to my other comment that it's not just our system. We have to be able to interoperate with other systems. For instance, we'd love to be able to tap into the pharmacy exchange APIs, which we don't control, yet there's information that's useful to us. I don't want to control that, right? So there's a number of use cases, long story short, and the underpinning of all of it is this idea of many nodes that need to work together but don't explicitly trust each other, nor is there really a mechanism for that to happen.
Right. So I recently had a conversation just on that pharmacy records use case. So my follow-up to you is, we're looking at an information supply chain. So the proof of concepts that you're looking at are really disrupting or disintermediating the supply chain itself, or they're just automating the current business process that the ecosystem has set for itself?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, again, I think I'm a big believer, and I think you need to be, going back to Adam's comment about the government doesn't have anybody who's useful. The few people who do, right? I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it.
Yeah.
You didn't take it personally.
No, not at all. I had my own business for a long time, so I hear where it's coming from. But I think we need to be practical. It's great to have great ambition, but we need to prove certain things in small doses. Okay. Right? No pun intended. So, the idea then is to disintermediate and to accomplish these great things. That's down the path. But to make some certain processes more efficient, that's what we're doing tactically and tactilely now. Right. But certainly it's doable, and certainly it's there. The other thing with public health, and this is, again, I encourage you to disprove me, right? My hypothesis, and this is what I've been trying to sell across the agency and other places, is that public health, in fact, is a beachhead for healthcare solutions when it comes to blockchain. And reason being that the number of stakeholders we have, 1, are generally known, 2, are generally limited. We're not talking about tens of thousands of payers and insurance companies or whatever, or millions, hundreds of millions of patients. So therefore, I think a lot of the ideas we have around healthcare could be proven at scale with public health before, but not kind of in parallel with some of the bigger ideas of patient record management and things like that.
Thank you. So the step 1 is to make the current process efficient, and step 2 is involve blockchain and other technologies to really disintermediate. And I think that's what we've seen with some things that Dr. Vic and their company are doing in institutional finance. So Andrew, hold on one second. Let's get to Jack and the previous question on business models.
On how to monetize?
Yeah.
So first off, initial coin offerings are not a revenue model. Contrary to belief, that's a way to get capital in and start operating, but it's not a long-term business model. So I think there's 2 ways to go about it. One is provide a service to enterprises that's faster, cheaper, better, safer. Just solve some of their problems and they'll pay you for it because they're going to be saving them money. The second is realign the interest of a community. I think Steemit does a really great job of it, and I think that the basic attention token, BAT, is going to be another really interesting one where instead of advertisers paying publishers directly, they have a way of discreetly monitoring where your attention is on a web page, and they reward you for paying attention to paying attention to advertisers. So now the publisher is being advertised, is being paid, and the consumer is being paid. So realigning incentives, or be better, faster, cheaper, safer for an enterprise.
Thank you. Andrew?
Yeah, he covered a lot of what I was going to cover. That was a good answer. I was just going to basically specify largely the same thing, that there's two distinctions. One is leveraging the increased efficiencies of these technologies to develop products and services that are a little bit cheaper, and then you get to increase your profit margins. Personally, I think that's the most boring example of how people are going to monetize these technologies. That'll fuel a little bit of growth in the near future, but the real money here, and this is what the gentleman before me was getting at, was monetizing things that were not previously monetizable. And that's where the potential value starts to approach infinity, because we don't know how much people's attention is worth. We don't know how we're going to, which one is going to monetize that effectively. And so that's really the point I wanted to make, is start monetizing networks and monetizing human activities that were previously unmonetizable. And then you can start having potentially incalculable values, because we simply don't know how much that stuff is worth yet.
Right, and that's the Steemit model. So I just wanted to come back to Jack's point, the business process side of things, doing things cheaper, better, faster. I come from that world in the incumbent enterprises, and we have seen the challenges that it takes to do that. And I think what has happened is, because of the blockchain infrastructure and its ecosystem, people now have to go beyond the boundaries of their company and look at the entire supply chain. And in fact, what it could do is technically reshape or even reconstruct different verticals so that the supply chain looks very differently. Internet was called the medium of information transfer, and now, to Andrew's point, we have an ecosystem, including in technology, that can allow for asset transfer and transfer of value. So I think, to your question, that's where the real benefit lies, to monetize those activities. One more question. Go ahead, please. Yes.
It's a little late to open up a whole new tech area, but I will anyway. The other major challenge that an early stage company has beyond securities exchanges and all the rest is intellectual property. And to some degree, a blockchain, all the forks and all the ways it's being reanimated are open source by their very nature. Is there any thoughts that the panel might have on how an entrepreneur thinks about creating sustainable competitive advantage on some proprietary technology related to a blockchain, which is essentially open source?
That's a great question. So let me repeat some data that we listed earlier. Reportedly, about 26,000 blockchain-related open source projects created on GitHub last year. Only 8% of them remain active today. Anybody wants to take the question on intellectual property? Yeah, Marta?
Sure. So blockchain offers an amazing opportunity for protecting intellectual property with its possibility of proof of provenance and timestamping, where we can actually say, this is my intellectual property. I have created this piece of art. I have created this piece of code, and put hash of that code or this piece of information on the blockchain, and now no longer can anyone copy it and claim it their own. So this is one way. I think that also the way that we share that information and build on top of it as a way to go around innovation. And that's how we've been using open source to create something, to create innovation faster.
Yeah, Steve?
Has anybody noticed the price of Bitcoin lately? So Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009 released open source code that he didn't patent, he didn't he copyrighted. The copyright gave everybody the permission to copy it, right? I imagine most people would be envious of his position right now.
Yes.
That is a game changer as far as, Bitcoin. First of all, Bitcoin would not work were it not open source. It also, interestingly, would not have worked if we knew who Satoshi was. And the reason for that is if there was a bug in that software, the implicit responsibility that you have running Bitcoin and holding Bitcoin is that you take responsibility for securing it and for using it. And if there's a bug in that software, you can try to sue Satoshi Nakamoto, but good luck with that, right? But I think you see that pattern repeating with things like Steemit and other blockchains as well. And I don't think you need to patent software. You don't need to protect intellectual property.
Right. Dr. Vic?
Yeah. I think make a distinction. What is your blockchain company doing? Are you building a blockchain or are you building an application layer on top of a blockchain? If you're building a blockchain, I agree with Stephen. Open source, in my opinion, is the way to go. All the best infrastructure have been built using open source technologies, contributions from around the world. If you're building an application layer, it's a lot easier to protect your IP. You can just do this traditionally as you would do any kind of software IP. I think on the previous question, I'd just like to make one comment. A lot of the things you see in this industry that people are saying they can use a blockchain for can and should be solved first using a centralized database before you involve something which is a blockchain. If you ask these people exactly what they are solving with a blockchain, 99% of the time, they'll be able to tell you.
Yeah, and we meet a lot of those kinds where, even the question of what is blockchain and why does it apply? That fundamental question still needs to be answered in a lot of those products. So we are a little bit behind time, but I think there's a lot of interest and passion here. So let's take one last question, and then that's what stands between you and drinks and food. So who wants to take that? Okay, I'm going to go in the back just because. Go ahead, please.
I work at an enterprise company. I'm one of those people inside of an innovation department. And I work in a highly regulated industry. And our lawyers are more scared of implementing the blockchain than actually leveraging the technology. And I was just kind of throwing it back out there is that to the CDC, how did you implement successful technology inside of a large corporation? And alternatively to Stephen, how do you feel about the risks of managing some of the private keys in that sense? And to the lawyers, have you experienced this from other enterprises that do want to use the technology, but does it actually make them more liable?
All right, so Jim?
Yeah, so I think it turns out, I'm sorry, what is your name?
Barrett.
Right, so it turns out that you can be an entrepreneur if you have that mindset pretty much within any kind of an organization. I don't mind this whole thing of like, you're an entrepreneur, if you happen to have two guys and you're in the basement. I think you can do it in other ways. I think what's important though is that you need to understand the business, right? You can't really go around, and it's what we try to talk about blockchain, unless you can put in very, very clear terms, clear not to Steve, who can understand everything under the sun, but clear to an epidemiologist or physician or a public health specialist. If you can do that, and you can find a champion, then you can do this. So that's kind of what we've done, right? So to me, that's the idea. You need to use your social engineering skills, right? And if you do that, then you can kind of build that little bubble. I mean, you don't have to be an innovation unit or anything like that per se, right? That's just my opinion. That's kind of how we've done it. And then the other thing is you do need to deliver, right? So it's no good having rhetoric and beautiful PowerPoint and not actually going any further.
Oh, we have a real product. I have 20 people. I'm just saying that we can't release it.
No, I'm with you. Well, it is a challenge.
Public.
one other thing I would tell you, and we've done this actually to see if you can believe it, is this. We actually did an internal crowdsourcing. So we have people from across the entire agency, which is pretty rare. I mean, in general, never mind this kind of context, who are working on this. So then the grassroots effort is being kind of naturally viral and it's spread around the agency. And that's helping. And it's going literally all the way up to like the deputy director to the CDC. I mean, so it's pretty high level in terms of kind of, I guess, exposure. Yet the people at the low level who are working on it actually are very deep because we're actually doing real work. We're not just, kind of like listening to webcasts. So that's the approach we've taken, and it's been fairly successful, and we've seen, results. But you really have to be committed to kind of playing both sides of this. Finding ways of kind of percolating up, but also building that grassroots to actually deliver things.
So you've done something like an internal ICO.
Well, yeah, we don't call it that, but yeah, I would say internal, and I'm a huge proponent of open source, by the way. Right. Everything we've built is open source, big time. I'm a really big proponent of internal open source model. We have submitted code to a couple of open source projects. We know the rigor it takes there. I think that's another misnomer. People who haven't done it don't really understand that the to submit code and have it become open source is a pretty big deal. You don't just write any old garbage and Oasis supports it. So if once you prove that people that actually is the case, this idea of an internal open source model, becomes to resonate a little bit.
Thank you. Sure. So coming back to the legal aspect of what Barrett was asking.
Yeah, I think it's important to separate the technology from the use case, right? So I mean, the technology is inherently just a software or database architecture. It's not regulated. I mean, I'm sure some country in the world could find a way to just say that the technology is bad and has to go away. But I mean, it's really, a lot of the regulation, particularly we're looking at right now, is driven by a couple things on the ICOs and it's interfacing with the securities world, right? But that has nothing to do with the fact that it's blockchain based. It has to do with you're giving someone something and they're giving you money. A lot of sort of participants around the Bitcoin ecosystem, might confront money transmission laws based on the way they interoperate with it, but Bitcoin itself, the technology, isn't really subject to any of that. And so thinking from an enterprise perspective and not knowing your industry, and I could see healthcare or something in the way that HIPAA expects data to move around, you might have problems, moving from the way you've been doing things to a blockchain, but it sounds like your attorneys might be a little bit overly concerned just from, all the hype in the media and all that, because I mean, ultimately, if it's just about a sort of a back-end database or whatever, then, that's not really regulated, right? So.
Thank you for that.
I'm curious what you've built that's so controversial.
Maybe we can help. Huh?
We're in insurance, so taking that private data and making it technically public. So in the insurance world, you would benefit because it should be public information, but we privatize it. We actually hold more risk because it's private and it should be public. Just your customer information and your claims and information is shared across several companies, but we hold it private. So that's the challenge that enterprises face.
So maybe it's actually more of a business decision than a legal one.
Right, exactly. And I could think of a couple of examples of insurance or peer-to-peer insurance and insurance industry being disrupted by blockchain companies. I think some of them are even in the Hyperledger world, so you might want to check that out. So let's actually wrap this up.
B3I.
Say that again, please.
Well, B3I, there is a huge consortium built by several insurance and banks.
That's reinsurance, though.
I'm sure there's more to explore on that. Okay, so let's wrap this up with one last question from to the panel, and then we'll get to the food and drinks. What is your one counterintuitive, half-crazy prediction about the next 5 years in this space? Who wants to go first? I can repeat the question. What is your one counterintuitive, half-crazy prediction about the next 5 years in this space? Jim?
Yeah, so, okay, this may be because I'm biased, but it's okay. So my opinion is this, that, again, as a startup, person, I was there and I never, thought that dealing with regulated industries, would be a good place to be, right? It's difficult. You got healthcare, you see it. So my prediction is this. I think, and there's some precedence for this, that the pharmaceutical industry, right, particularly because of the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, that becomes law in 2023, is a tremendous opportunity in a very regulated, very incestuous business to get in as a startup and really make an impact.
Thank you, Jim. Who's up next? Mitchell?
Yes, I am. The IRS will audit every ICO, especially those that have happened overseas, and there'll be lots of tax problems.
Is that your dream?
No, we actually don't like when our clients get audited. It's not fun no one has fun.
That's his official statement.
And I think in the next 5 years, there'll be at least 10 countries that make their currency a cryptocurrency, and their currency will be their own crypto.
That's exciting. Stephen?
In the future, you will only be able to buy your electricity for cryptocurrency of some kind, maybe Bitcoin, because the energy producers will refuse to sell it for anything else. I also think related to that, you'll see energy companies and mining companies sort of start to merge. Either mining companies will start buying energy producers, or energy producers will start buying mining operations.
Yeah, we're starting to see some movement on that already. So thank you, Stephen. Let's go with Austin.
Wish we could have gotten this question in advance. I wish we had a little more than 5 years. But I'll actually say, I think we'll see the fall, at least from a valuation perspective, in the beginning of the end of the model for a lot of the giants that we've become familiar with. For example, I don't see how a Reddit or a Facebook survives a model like a Steemit, where you can kind of do everything the same way, but all of a sudden, instead of all the intermediary getting all that ad revenue, it's being paid out to the participants in the ecosystem. So as soon as the technical challenge can be solved to sort of give the same sort of user experience and all of that, why would anyone sort of stick around in the old world where the intermediaries were capturing all the value? So I think that applies to companies like Uber, the social media networks. I mean, the banks probably a longer time frame. Any of the regulated environments, a longer time frame. But those big tech giants that are largely just data movers that are capturing ad revenue based on our attention, I think that if not sort of rapidly in decline, they're at least terrified.
Right. So if I were to ask a follow-up, which I won't, but the question would be, could they just not pivot into that space themselves? But
They could, but that would be incredibly less lucrative than their current model in theory. And
Sure.
To the extent they're retaining monetization of that in a meaningful way, then they're probably capturing value that a Steemit could deliver to the ecosystem, and therefore they could pivot, but the revenue would then dry up.
Okay. Thank you.
Also, we'd be more than happy for them to launch a smart media token.
Only if it's on your platform, right?
Well, yeah, that's, yeah.
Jack, go ahead.
I think with use cases like identity and land registration and financial, like what this technology can do for financial inclusion, I think we're going to watch an emerging market jump at least 50 spots in the next year. I think that this technology is going to enable middle class to emerge in the first emerging market that really dives in and starts applying this technology to their citizens.
Right, and there's a lot more adoption in the emerging markets on these platforms anyways. Dr. Young?
Yeah, I think blockchain is supposed to be decentralized, but what may end up, maybe we will have a lot of centralization in the end. We might have some super companies like super banks, for example.
Right.
The banks will feel the competition pressure. They may have to merge and cut costs and maybe operate within a blockchain environment. And the same thing can be said about other environment. We might have maybe the big tech companies may move in, like Google or Facebook. They may find it very important to act in this space, and potentially they can be controlling a lot of things in the end. So.
Right, awesome. Thank you for that. Andrew?
Yeah, those are all really great answers. Unfortunately, one of the downsides of working at a startup is that I'm too myopic. I'm too focused on what we're working on. I would say that I do think that people are underestimating token transactions that are related to social interactions. It's currently the fastest growing type of transaction, and I think over the next 5 years, people are going to see that probably the largest sector or portion of transactions are associated with social interaction.
Wonderful. Thank you. Marta?
I think I'm going to build on top of everything that everyone said. My intuition for the crazy and also wishful thinking for the next 5 years is that we will face a world of self-governed identity and privacy, where we will start owning our data and selling it to the companies, and will be incentivized to share our data with companies. So it will no longer be your Amazon stealing data from you and collecting it. It will be you saying, yes, Amazon, please, I want to sell you my information about how much cups do I buy every day.
That's a great point. Can I amend my statement? To Marta's point, which is perfect, in the near future, people will expect to get paid for things that they never got paid for before. The first step was freemium. The next step is getting paid for this stuff.
Right. So it's my data anyways. I'm generating it, so why not get paid for it?
Yeah, exactly.
Dr. Wick?
I'm going to try and stick to saying something counterintuitive like you asked.
Thank you.
In the next few years, I think we will see banks and law firms embracing automation technology that will potentially result in job losses internally. And linking that to blockchain, I actually think that there will be more embracing of public blockchain and public cryptocurrencies.
Wonderful, thank you. So here's mine. We will be offering meditations to prove the spiritual power of blockchain. But since you guys like these kind of things, so just some next steps. We are working on things like blockchain boot camps, more for the business track and also for the technology track. And we're also working on for thought leadership forum, which is going to be global and by invitation only, but mostly to understand how we can really produce these products and then expand the tent beyond just the underlying infrastructure of blockchain, but going beyond that to include artificial intelligence, IoT, smart contracts, virtual reality, and augmented reality. So I welcome any thoughts and opinions on that. On that note, let's thank all our panelists. Thank you so much. I know this has been long. It's been wonderful. Thank you for such a productive, nuanced conversation, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Please join us for the reception outside.
Thanks, everybody.
Right.